Good evening. The August 5th meeting of the Planning Commission is now in session. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Kate, may we have a roll call, please?
Gary Cunningham.
Here.
Patty Crowan.
Here.
Doug Bryson.
Here.
Bruce Robinson.
Here.
Sean Keir is absent. Miles Schlesinger.
Here.
And Steve Griffiths.
Here. Are there any agenda changes or revisions?
There are not.
All right. May we have a motion to approve the minutes of our last meeting, August 15th?
I'll move to do so.
Is there a second?
A second?
All in favor?
Aye.
The minutes have been approved. Now is the time in our meeting for public comments on non-agenda items or matters not involving the public hearing. If anybody would like to come up and speak, you have 3 minutes. This is a time to speak on a non-agenda item. If you're here to speak on our public hearing, now is not the time to do that. Please state your name and talk directly into the microphone. Yes.
Good evening. I'm Mr. Baird. I think I wanted to talk just a little bit today about my experience with the whole process that's been taking place of the zoning of the Rhodes End District. Now that we're have a plan basically in place, we're going to be voting on that soon, and it comes to my mind that the whole thing starts right here. And sometimes I know when I walked away, I felt that on retrospect, I looked at the process, and it was a lot of the pressures from different groups, and that, in my mind, caused a detrimental stress, or a straitjacket, if you will, and resulted in kind of a utilitarian type of restraining on the codes as we put them together. I would hope that as we move forward with this meeting and in the future, I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's about the people that live here. It's about the people that live in these communities, the people that work in these communities. They're the ones that have to deal with the social environment and the culture that we create in these meetings. I know that not everybody's going to be happy and not everybody's going to be satisfied. It's part of the process. But I would hope that we would do our best to engage the public and try to look at the physical realities of what's happening in the neighborhoods and try to consider that, and also try to understand conceptual ideas that come out that aren't necessarily put together when you stick to the rigors of the way that the codes are written and the statutes are written. You end up just getting this bland type of community that's just stickered one after another after another. It's the same thing. So be open to different ideas, different design plans, different conceptual ideas of what the culture of a neighborhood could be. And I wanted to leave and start the meeting out that way. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to present a public comment on a non-agenda item? Seeing none, we'll go forward. There are no final orders, resolutions, or written communications. None are scheduled for tonight's meeting. And we are now, before we begin the next section, I would like to remind you, if you've got a cell phone, please put it on silence and put it away. Thank you. So it is now 6:07 PM. The public hearing for file APP 2017-01 is now open. This is a quasi-judicial land use hearing for an appeal of an administrative decision. The subject of this hearing is an appeal of a site plan review approval for construction of an apartment complex as part of a mixed-use development. The project site is located at 3173 Northeast West Devils Lake Road, Assessors Map 07-11-02-CD. Tax lots 2806, 2807, and 2808 in the Professional Campus PC zone. The appellants are Meg Portwood and the neighbors of Northeast West Devils Lake Road. The project applicant is Nathan Knott, and the property owner is James Ransom. The matter at issue for this hearing is a determination of the appropriateness of the director's interpretation of the requirements of the code, as identified by the appellant's notice of appeal. Because quasi-judicial proceedings require the observance of certain procedural safeguards, the Commission must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. Does any member of the Commission wish to declare an ex parte contact, conflict of interest, or bias in this matter? Commissioner Schlesinger?
I have driven by.
Please speak in the microphone.
I have driven by the property and am acquainted with the location of it, and I was told earlier that I should announce that.
All right, and I have a couple of announcements. I read both the newspaper articles that appeared on this issue recently in the last week. My dentist is the owner of the property, Dr. James Ransom. He's been my dentist for the last 7 or 8 years. And I was approached by a member of the neighborhood in early July expressing concern about the decision, the approval of this site review plan. I believe that was before there was any decision to go forward with an appeal, because the word appeal was not mentioned in our conversation. If it had been, I would have terminated the conversation quickly. But this person was distressed with the decision that had been made and communicated her concern to me. Yes, Commissioner Robinson.
Thank you. Jim's also my dentist, and I did hear some conversation about the construction of the project. I didn't hear any controversy or anything about the appeal, and I don't feel like I have a conflict.
I should add, I don't feel that I have a conflict either. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Commissioner.
I too read the article in the newspaper, just the Newport Times. That's a conflict, but I did read the article.
So can all of us who mentioned that we had ex parte contacts say that we have not prejudiced this application and are not prejudiced or biased by any potential conflict, prior contacts, or involvement, and will make our decision based solely on the application of the relevant criteria and standards to the facts and evidence in the record of this proceeding. Agree? No.
Yes.
All right. Are there any conflicts of interest? Seeing none. All right. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the qualifications of the commissioner to participate in this matter? Seeing none. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the jurisdiction of the commission to consider this matter? Seeing none. So the following statements are required to be made at the commencement of the hearing pursuant to the City Code and ORS 197.7635. Staff will now lead a list of the applicable substantive criteria for this decision. Mr. Townsend.
Lincoln City Municipal Code, Section 17.76.040A, appeals, decision of the planning director. 17.76040E, review body decision. 17.24.020, professional campus zone, uses permitted. 17.08, definitions, specifically the definition of elderly housing and the definition of mixed use. 17.56050, off-street parking and loading regulations, number of spaces required. 17.56.060, off-street parking and loading regulations, joint use of facilities.
Thank you. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward the applicable substantive criteria previously listed, or such other criteria in the plan or land use regulations which the person believes applies to the decision. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to LUBA, the Land Use Board of Appeals, on that issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the decision maker to respond to the issue precludes any action for damages in circuit court. Prior to the end of the hearing, any person who had participated may request a continuance to provide additional testimony, argument, or evidence, or request that the record be left open to submit additional written testimony, argument, or evidence. Before the staff presents a report, I would like to summarize the adopted public hearing procedures. A brochure outlining procedures is at the entrance to the council chambers. Generally, the order of proceedings will be as follows: preliminary matters and required statements, staff report, questions of staff, appellant's presentation, applicant's presentation, those in support of the appeal, those opposed, rebuttal by the appellant, rebuttal by the applicant, requests of continuances or to leave the record open, close of the hearing, close of the record, requests to submit written argument, deliberations, and decision. The city has established some time limits. The appellant will have 15 minutes to speak. After the appellant testifies, the applicant will also have 15 minutes to speak. After that, any person may speak up to 3 minutes. If the Planning Commission asks questions, your time responding to the questions will not be counted in your time limit. Hearing procedures also allow the chair to limit repetitive testimony. If you wish to speak, please write your name and mailing address clearly on the sign-up list at the entrance. Please speak directly into the microphone and begin by stating your name only. If you also have written testimony to submit into the record, please provide a copy to our recorder. So, may the staff please present its report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Just by way of background, this is an appeal of a site plan approval of a 30-unit apartment complex. The site on which it's located is zoned Professional Campus, PC. It's adjacent to an existing dental office. As you heard, a couple of the commission members are customers there. The site plan approval was made on July 20th of this year and subject to 22 conditions of approval. The property is in this pink area. What we're talking about is these 3 lots right here, the upper area of the pink. The pink is the area that is zoned Professional Campus. This large area of pink down here to the right is where the hospital is. We have Highway 101 out here on the left side of the slide, Holmes Road running across here, the lake out here, and West Devils Lake Boulevard, or West Devils Lake Road here. So again, it's here. And you can see the yellow on here is zoned single-family residential, R175, which means 7,500 square foot minimum lot size. The brown is multifamily residential, And the light green here adjacent is open space. Red is general commercial. So looking at aerial photograph, again, the lake here on the right, the property we're talking about is right in here, near the center. I'm just going to zoom in on a couple of steps here. So here's the property, again, Holmes Road up here, the hospital down here at the bottom on this slide. There's an apartment development over here at the far left of the property, just off of Holmes Road. And actually, if you look back, there's also, just out of the picture at the bottom here, just below the hospital office buildings and the Early Learning Center, is another apartment development. So then finally zooming in, we have this building near the center is the dental office. These two lots here are the properties where the apartments are being proposed. This property here below the dental office is Ms. Portwood's office for orientation. This is the site plan that was submitted and approved. Just for clarity, I've marked it up a little bit here. This building here on the right, this is the existing dental office. And these three other areas outlined in red are the proposed apartment buildings. This is Building A, which would be adjacent to the Portwood property here in the lower right. Building B and Building C. Building C is the one that would include the elderly housing, as I understand it, and we'll get to the importance of that in a little while. Then there's also shows the parking areas. Back in 2005, we approved a site plan for this property for the dental building, which is marked here with the A oriented here so that north is at the top, so the A is on its side. Here the writing is on its side. Then there were two future office buildings proposed, one here in the upper left corner and one down here in the lower right. And then at the bottom there's a detention basin, and that actually was put in to deal with the runoff from the proposed buildings and parking. So again, this is the change where up here was an office building and up down here was an office building. Now they're talking about three apartment buildings instead. And I'm not sure how clear this is, but this is the site plan overlaid on the aerial photo. So again, we have the existing dental building, Ms. Portwood's building here, and Building A, B, and C, and West Devils Lake Road Boulevard, West Devils Lake Road out here. So we also have, in the site plan process, we were provided with elevations of the buildings. This is Building A, and this is the front of it, the front being the side that faces the parking lot, which is internal to the development. And this is the back of it, which would be the side that faces Ms. Portwood's office. So as the chair mentioned, the matter at issue here in this appeal is the appropriateness of the director's interpretation of the requirements of this title, and that's a quote. And this title is referring to Title 17, which is the zoning provisions. And the burden of proof of basically of proving that the director's decision was not appropriate. Me being the director, my interpretation of the requirements of the title, proving that I didn't get it right, the burden is on the appellants. So you have actually four options. In the staff report I said three, but actually there's four options. You can affirm the decision, you can reverse it, you can modify it, or you can remand it. And by remanding it, that means basically start over, or you can remand it for limited reasons, say to address a specific issue or something like that. So the issues that were raised on appeal: mixed-use development, parking, traffic impact study, stormwater detention, adequacy of sewer, building height and setbacks, privacy, and emergency access. So there's 8 issues, and there's some sub-issues in some of them, but I'll try to go through them one at a time. One of the key issues, and the reason I put it on here first, is about mixed-use development. The professional campus zone allows mixed-use development as a permitted use, and that is defined as a mix of commercial and residential uses that are planned and developed together, and that's key language, on the same site or adjoining sites, and it can be in separate buildings. One of the key issues from the appellants is that, well, let me back up here. This is the 2005 approval here. So we have the proposed dental building here and the 2 office buildings, and we're saying that this is slides are somehow out of order here, but we have the 2005 approval. And what we're saying, the appellants have said that because we had a 2005 approval and then something different in 2017, they're not planned and developed together. And the together is the key issue there. In staff's opinion, the planned and developed together requirement is satisfied. The change from office uses to apartments is an amendment to the original site plan. And actually, the ordinance contemplates that there will be changes to site plans, or there can be changes to site plans, and in fact sets out a procedure for what they call major amendments or major changes. And if there is a major change, then it is required to go through, just basically essentially go through the whole site plan review process again. One of the changes that's a major change is the changes in the location of, amount of land devoted to, changes in the location of or amount of land devoted to a specific use on the site. So we're changing from office to apartments here as such a change, and in fact they've gone through the site plan review process, even notice it to the surrounding community, the public meeting, and so on. So I believe that this is exactly what the ordinance contemplates for changes in a site plan, because over time things change and economic situation changes, property owners' desires of what to do with their property can change. So we do actually allow changes in site plans, and that's what's happened here. One of the issues that the neighbors raise is that the person who owned the property at the time of the 2005 approval abandoned the plan and partitioned the property, with apparently the partition being evidence of abandoning the plan. I would just say that the partition was consistent with the plan. It just put Building B on one lot, Building C on another, and Building A on another lot. So it just, the partition would be consistent with that if that's what the owner intended to do. That property owner has passed away, and a new property owner has it, but site plan approval isn't personal. It runs through the land, so that site plan approval was still in effect, and is proposed to be amended by this proposal that we have the appeal on tonight. The next issue was about whether there's enough parking for the property or for the proposed development. There's actually several issues around that, one relating to the elderly housing, one to ADA accessible, and another to joint use of parking. Turning to elderly housing first, The applicant proposes that there be 5 elderly housing units. We have a provision in the code for relating to the amount of parking required for elderly housing units that says it's 1 per bedroom plus 1 for an employee, and I'll get to employee in a minute, but the proposal is that these elderly housing apartments be 1-bedroom apartments, so they only would require 1 parking space. If it was not an elderly housing unit, even though it only had 1 bedroom or even was a studio, it would require 2 parking spaces per unit. So by designating 5 of these units as elderly housing, they reduce the parking requirement by 5 spaces. The PC zone, professional campus zone, specifically allows elderly housing units, and that's, quote, elderly housing units. The question that's raised on appeal is whether elderly housing must be in an elderly housing complex. The definition of elderly housing in the ordinance is that it's housing in which at least 85% of the individual housing units in the elderly housing complex are either studio or 1 or 2-bedroom units, and which is, and there's some things that aren't relevant here, and is intended for and solely occupied by persons 62 years of age or older. That's the relevant part of the ordinance. So the real question is, ultimately, is what does it have to be in a complex? So first, there's no need, I want to say there's no need for the employee parking because this isn't the kind of elderly housing that provides extensive services for elderly people. This is just independent living units. It's just limited to persons 62 years of age or older. The real issue there is the importance of that 85% or more, because if any elderly housing unit to qualify as an elderly housing unit has to be in an elderly housing complex, then this does not meet the requirement because it's 50% 3-bedroom apartments in this development. One key thing is that the code relating to the professional campus zone doesn't say elderly housing complex, it says elderly housing units. If you believe that, as I do, that that's an important distinction, then this would be allowed. If it's not an important distinction, then the elderly housing allowance would not apply in this situation. Next, the appellants raise issue of ADA accessible parking. The requirement for ADA accessible parking for parking lots with 51 to 75 parking spaces is that there must be 3 ADA spaces, the first of which must be a van accessible space. And in fact, there are 3 ADA spaces provided on the site, so it meets that standard. And actually, there's a 4th one too at the dental office, but I think that's far enough away from the apartments that it really doesn't apply in this case. So I've marked them on the map here in green. Again, this is building C over here. There's an ADA space here. Building B has 2 ADA spaces, including a van space at the extreme end. And for reference, this is the dental clinic's ADA space, which also is a van space.
Which one is a dental space?
Pardon me?
Which one is a dental office space?
This one right up here,
Ah,
the upper, towards the upper right here. Okay. Then the next issue on parking is about joint use parking. The site plan as proposed actually is short 7 parking spaces. In other words, the dental clinic is required to have 26 parking spaces. The apartments are required to have 55 if the elderly housing provision applies. If it doesn't, it's required to have 60. Assuming 55, they're required to have a total of 81 parking spaces, and they show 74 parking spaces. So the proposal is that they would share 7 parking spaces with the dental clinic to serve the apartments. We do allow that when there's an agreement between the property owners, if it can be demonstrated that the use of the exact words are provided that the operations and parking needs do not overlap in point of time. And that's up to the applicant to demonstrate that, in fact, that happens. There's a condition of approval that says that they have to demonstrate that in a means that is satisfactory to the planning director, in other words, satisfactory to me. And I've suggested that that can be done possibly through a parking study, which would look at the hours and usage of the parking at the dental office, as well as the hours and usage of parking at some nearby apartment complexes, to see if, for instance, if at the hours that the dental clinic usage is normally maximized, that may be a time for the apartments when there won't be very much need, and concurrently at the time when the apartments maximize their need, the dental clinic is not making use or not making much use of their parking facilities. So that just, there needs to be some demonstration of the fact that there is no significant or no overlap in time on the operations. The appellants argue the apartments are used 24 hours a day, and therefore their full need runs all day. And if you believe that to be the case, then there will be an issue with joint parking. But the approval is saying if you can demonstrate that that the joint operation, the joint parking can function properly, then it would be allowed. And we have allowed it in a couple of cases, nothing recently, nothing's come up recently, but we have allowed it in some cases, principally for commercial uses, is my recollection.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Earlier you said an agreement between the property owners. That seems a little vague in that property owners can change and the agreement might not. Does it become a lien on the land, basically?
It would have to run with the land. It would, yeah. So
So
it
it'd be
couldn't
an
be just
easement.
sell to somebody else and, okay, no more agreement.
It would act as an easement then on the property?
Essentially, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next, the appellants argue that a traffic impact study is required. So we recently amended the city code to specify the situations in which a traffic impact study is required. There's 2 situations that the appellants argue possibly apply. The first refers to an existing or proposed access driveway that does not meet minimum spacing or site distance requirements, or a driveway located where vehicles entering or leaving the property are restricted, or such vehicles are likely to queue or hesitate at an approach or access connection, thereby creating a safety hazard. I've highlighted the thereby creating a safety hazard language, and this is a direct quote out of the ordinance. So I've highlighted the lettering in red there because I want to specify that applies to each of the situations. In other words, each of the three items called out there. So access driveway does not meet minimum spacing or site distance standards, thereby creating a safety hazard. Or a driveway located where vehicles entering or leaving are restricted or likely to queue or hesitate, thereby creating a hazard. So I don't believe that applies just to that last piece. The other one that the appellants argue assert may apply is, again, this is a quote from the ordinance, a change in internal traffic patterns that may cause safety problems such as a backup onto the highway or traffic crashes in the approach area. There's no evidence was provided that actually that either of these fully apply, but I want to go through some of it just to make sure everything's covered. The appellants do raise three issues relating to traffic study, one on the capacity of West Devils Lake Road, one on access spacing, and one on the clear vision triangles. Actually, the key things here, the capacity of West Devils Lake Road, we don't have much in the way of traffic counts. In other words, we're not constantly doing traffic counts, but the transportation system plan actually does have some information on the intersection of West Devils Lake Road and Holmes Road. And what it says is that that intersection is at level of service A, which is the best it can be. There's no significant delays or anything at that intersection. The summer afternoon peak traffic is about 200 vehicles an hour, and that's the peak afternoon summertime. So that's basically the worst that it gets normally in the summer. 200 vehicles per hour. I forget how that works out to, about a little more than 3 a minute. The road, that intersection, or at least West Devils Lake Road, is at, according to the transportation system plan again, at 28.9% of its capacity. In other words, there's about 71% of unused capacity on that road. So the assertion that traffic is bad and the road doesn't have the capacity to serve the apartment complex, which is expected to, based on Institute of Traffic Engineers standards, should generate about 200 trips a day. The idea that the road doesn't have the capacity to handle that is not accurate. There's plenty of excess capacity on West Devils Lake Road. Also, a question was raised about access spacing, in other words, the distance from other streets, and the access driveway is the required spacing should be 265 feet from a street entering a minor arterial. The nearest streets are Holmes Road, which is approximately 385 feet away, so that's further away than the standard requires, and Northeast 27th, which is about a quarter mile away, which is even further. One key thing is the clear vision triangle. Now, again, actually, neither of the appellants raised this issue, but we went back and took a look at it, and at the time the 2005 site plan approval was made, the site met the clear vision standards. We changed those standards recently, and so instead of being a fairly limited area of a not equilateral, but there's two equal sides on the triangle, we now changed it to 10 feet back along the driveway and then 50 feet along the street. Right at the property lines. The standard is not at the street, but at the property line. You can see right here in the left-hand triangle there's a sign there. That's where it's a monument sign, so it's down at ground level. So that actually would be a violation, or is a violation of the current clear vision triangle, but it's grandfathered. There also is some vegetation in the clear vision triangle to the right, which could be perceived as violating the clear vision requirement. The key thing, again, is that language that I highlighted in red was about creating a hazard. And the city engineer has examined the site and actually went out and found that the natural stopping point where you're determining whether it's safe to turn onto Devil's Lake Road from the driveway there that's there now is actually forward of the triangle. So you don't stop back here at the property line. You pull out further. And in fact, she found that there is no hazard there created by the vegetation or the sign. Next is whether stormwater detention is adequate. There is an existing stormwater detention facility there that was designed and sized to serve the proposed development of the 3 office buildings plus the parking lot, that with the two office buildings and much of the parking lot to be developed in a later phase. Those later phases were not built and now are proposed for the apartments. The city engineer has said that that detention site is expected to be adequate, but there is a condition of approval that has to be demonstrated that it's adequate, and if it's not, then it's got to be enlarged to provide the proper detention. The appellants argue that it often has water in it, and that's actually what it's supposed to do. The idea for a detention basin is that it's supposed to hold the water back so that it runs off at the same rate it would run off if the site was not developed, so that downstream facilities aren't overwhelmed by a large flow of water. So, in fact, the fact that water accumulates in the detention facility is exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to hold water so it runs off slowly and doesn't cause flooding or anything like that downstream from it.
Richard? How much difference is the impermeable surfaces from the previous site plan to the current?
I don't know. We haven't measured that. I don't think it's appreciable because, again, the 2005 site plan had some very substantial parking lots. And so if there is much difference, it's not that much, and there is room to expand the detention facility. And there's ways you can do that. You can do it by making it larger, just covering a larger area, or actually you can build up berms or whatever to make it hold more. Actually, not too long ago, I saw a really interesting detention facility in Wilsonville that actually has a basketball court and raised tiered seating, like retaining walls, and actually in a substantial storm, that's all underwater, but then the water runs off slowly, but it is designed to hold back the water, and actually it's used as it becomes not just a functional, one function thing, but it actually has multiple functions where it also is an asset to the community. The next thing is whether there was adequate sewer capacity. There actually is no evidence presented of any lack of capacity. The city engineer has expressed that her opinion that the capacity is there, but there's a condition of approval requiring the applicant to demonstrate that, in fact, there is sufficient capacity before they'd be able to build on the site. And Another issue raised on the appeal was the how building height is to be determined. And we do that at the time of building permit approval. The site plan application materials does have elevations of, representative elevations of the buildings. We're able to determine that the site was large enough to contain what they're proposing to develop. But we will determine the building height and as a result of that, the building setbacks with precision at the time of building permit review. Then one of the first steps in building is to put in the forms for pouring the concrete for the building footings. When the forms are put in, we go out and inspect the forms to make sure they have the proper setbacks, so that we don't end up with a building in the setback. So all the work is putting in the forms. They haven't poured anything yet, so they can be changed at that point if for some reason they're not adequate or not accurate. Another issue is raised about protecting the privacy of people on Ms. Portwood's property. Unfortunately, there's no ordinance criterion relating to that. There's no requirement or standard requiring someone developing a property to protect their neighbor's privacy. There's nothing violated there because there is no standard. And the final issue that was raised was about emergency vehicle access. In the course of site plan review, we send out materials to many people, many organizations, including the police, the ambulance service, and the fire district. The only concern we had expressed was from the fire district. The fire chief came to the site plan review meeting, discussed his concern, which was principally about about basic fire truck turnaround. Discussed that with the applicant, and they were able to work out an approach that was mutually satisfactory. So there is no issue on emergency vehicle access at this point. So that's what I have for staff report.
Does the commission have any questions of the staff?
I do.
Yes.
Richard. So in 2005, when this was first put forward as a development, it was 3 office buildings, correct?
Right.
Is that defined as multi-use?
No. No, that was not mixed use. That was single use.
So it's a significant amendment to change it from single use to mixed use?
It's a major change, and so that's why it went back through the site plan approval process.
Okay. Are there any time constraints on amendments?
No.
Okay, I have more questions.
Anyone else?
I have more.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
What's the density requirement for multi-use in an R1 7.5, which I think is the next nearest residential use?
The R175 doesn't allow apartments, so but the density that's allowed there is 1 unit per 7,500 square feet. So the minimum lot size is 7,500 square feet.
Okay, when you had the first map up, that was a larger scale or a smaller scale showing a larger area. I thought you mentioned that just to the south of that there was another apartment complex. What zoning is that in?
Well, there's an apartment complex down here just south of the hospital. That is zone multifamily. And the apartments over here off of Holmes Road are also in the multifamily zone.
And the density requirement for those?
Sorry?
Is there a density requirement? How many people can you cram on a lot?
There is in the RM zone. In both of those cases, it would be You have 8,000 square feet for the first two units, and then 2,250 square feet for each additional unit. But in the definition of mixed use, we don't say anything about density requirements. So actually, it comes down to not lot area per se, but really it comes down to whether you can meet the parking requirement. You put as many apartments on as you can meet the parking requirement for when you have
Okay.
mixed use.
And this is short, what did I hear, 7 spaces?
7 parking spaces.
If you identify as an apartment as an elderly, I hate that term, but an elderly apartment, what if you can't rent it to an elderly person? What happens to that unit?
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
What if you can't rent it to an elderly person,
Then you can't rent it,
period?
period. Or unless you build more parking spaces.
Okay. And are those, I'm a little confused between the elderly parking spaces and the ADA parking spaces. Are either of those flagged for placard use only?
The ADA spaces are marked for handicap access only, but there's no such thing as an elderly parking space, so it just, the parking at the buildings are available for everybody unless the property owner decides to assign parking spaces to particular units. In some places they do that, some places they don't.
That's all for now.
All right, anyone else? I have some questions. Does a planned and developed together concept include purpose and use?
Does it include what?
Purpose and use?
I don't know that it says anything about that. It just says planned and developed together.
So if the purpose and use of the buildings change when amendment is made to the original site plan is requested, can we truly say they were planned and developed together?
That's the question you have to answer. It's my belief that it does, but the appellants disagree.
And then, was mixed use included in the professional campus zone when the initial site plan was approved in 2005?
Yes, that was added, I think, in 2001. Yeah, 2001.
Is that it? So, in 2005, they could have requested, instead of putting offices on that property, putting an apartment on that property.
That's right.
And we have no, what kind of guarantee, if any, would we have the 5 units would actually be rented to the elderly, people 62 and over?
Typically, we require some documentation if that's happening, and we do follow up. We've had a couple of apartment complexes built recently that included some elderly housing, and we try to monitor that to make sure that they're complying with the law on that.
Okay. And then you mentioned examples of shared use, that there's some here in Lincoln City. Could you be specific and provide us with an example of where that happens?
One is the Mazatlan. The one that jumps to mind is the Mazatlan restaurant, and they have a joint use agreement with property directly across Highway 101 from that. I think they use for employee parking.
So they use it when the restaurant is closed, or how does that work? Or
No, they're using the restaurant's using somebody else's parking, so.
during
Yeah.
work hours? Okay. So do the requirements that apply to building an apartment, say in a multifamily zone, the landscaping, recreational requirements, space, apply to apartments built in other zones like the professional zone?
We apply basically like the setback standards, the landscaping standards, the recreation area standards, we apply those to,
So does
all
this,
zones.
do the preliminary plans for this place have the 7,500 feet of recreational?
yes.
It does, all right. And can you tell us specifically how the fire chief and the developer solved the problem of the concern the fire chief had?
As I recall, it was a little bit of reconfiguration of a small area, the parking area, so that there would be sufficient turning radius for the fire trucks. You may want to ask the applicant
All right, thank you.
specifically what he did.
Any more questions from commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Bryson.
Richard, did I understand you correctly that some of these units are going to be 3 bedrooms, but yet they only require 2 parking spaces?
That's right. Our ordinance only requires 2 parking spaces per residential unit, no matter the size of it, with the exception of like elderly housing. If it's a studio or a 1-bedroom, then it only has to have 1 parking space. But you could have a 10-bedroom house that only has 2 parking spaces required.
Can you demonstrate to us where the off-street parking is available for this location?
Well, it's the, on the site plan, there's spaces along here, here, and then between the buildings down in here. That's where the required spaces are. And presumably some 7 of the dental offices spaces as well.
But none on the access point and none on east Devils Lake Highway?
No, none on West Devils Lake Road, and none along the access area, except there's these 8, there's 4 here and 4 here. I think these exist now, and they were reconfiguring the southernmost, but the rest are all in the parking lots.
Is there any specificity to if somebody parks a boat in one of the parking spaces or a trailer and takes up his space? Are there any time limits that can stay there?
No, we don't have anything like that, and actually we did, and actually took it out of the ordinance not too long ago, after surveying, I think, all of the apartment developments in the city, found that almost all of them prohibit parking of boats and RVs. If you have one and you live there, you park it someplace else, like self-storage or in a lot somewhere else.
Do we know if that's been met with this property owner?
I don't know.
I have one more.
Any further questions? Yes,
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Any
Crowe.
visitor parking at all provided?
There's no requirement for that. So, as we said, there are no excess spaces, I'll say that, which you might think of as a visitor. The ordinance requires 2 per unit, plus, except for the elderly housing, which in this situation, being 1 bedroom, would only be 1 per unit. Presumably, that takes into account some limited amount of visitor parking, but there's no separate visitor parking requirement.
So theoretically, that dental office parking lot could fill up with visitors.
If you had a good party, you could do that, yeah.
That's attorney.
Just on the issue of verification, you asked, how do you know if the people that are being rented to meet the age requirements? Remember, you cannot discriminate based on age in housing, except that under the exemption to the Fair Housing Act, and this is 42 U.S.C. 3607 2C, that there is a provision for this, and it's reflected in our code, type of elderly housing. And so you can't just say, I'm going to provide elderly housing, and to get a reduced parking requirement, you have to comply with the statute, the federal statute. The federal statute tells you you're going to have policies and procedures, and you're going to have to get affidavits and verification and comply with the requirements. So it's not just, oh, no, really, it's elderly housing. You have to you're fitting an exemption to the law. Law says you're not allowed to specify based on age, except under this program.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Townsend. Yeah. Now time for the appellant's presentation, and the appellant will have 15 minutes.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add one thing. You also, I just want to remind you that you have the staff report, and you've gotten several letters that were submitted after the staff report, and you found a number of them at your seat tonight. Those are part of the record.
Thank you. Yeah. So please state your name and speak directly into the microphone so we can all hear you clearly. And you will have 15 minutes. And you'll be dividing your time? All right. Okay. Go right ahead. Yeah,
I get to start. My name is Meg Portwood, and my clinic is located at 3015 Northeast West Devils Lake Road. And I'm not an attorney, and I'm not a planner, and I just work really, really hard to provide health care to this community. I've been here since 1976, and I'm a Lincoln City citizen, taxpayer, and I've seen a lot of changes in this community since the time we got here. So I want to give a brief history of the property as I know it. The clinic was first built in 1967 by Dr. Hare, and it included over 3 acres. And in 1976, Chuck and Renee Stringham purchased the property, and I started working for them in January of that year. The property was sold by the Stringhams to Lincoln County in 1987, and so I rented from Lincoln County Health and Human Services, and the county had clinics there. I worked for them as well as in private practice when the county was not in town. So always my clinic has been providing primary health care and mental health and public health. In 1995, the clinic was sold by the county to myself and Jeff Metcalf, and the two of us, at that time, that neighborhood, as many of the residents probably recall, was like a little jigsaw puzzle of little areas that were county and little areas that were city. So at the time of purchase, we were mandated to annex to the city, and that's the first time that I met with the Planning Commission in 1995. And at that time, you have the 2 exhibits of the huge document that we had, indicating that that area was parceled 3.46 acres as a healthcare and medical-related services and facilities. And the Planning Commission at that time indicated that it was PC, and I understand that's now been changed, but again, I'm not a planner or an attorney, but that property had always been used in medical health care, and the long-term plans of the Planning Commission and the city was to provide health care services, especially since it was close to North Lincoln Hospital, and at that time Lincolnshire was being built, which is now called Lakeview. And it was further purported that that property could be used for offices, clinics, a nursing home, childcare, a pharmacy, again, all health-related clinics. So that was always kind of the purview that we had, that this was a healthcare community area located in a neighborhood. And after 1995, Jeff and I parceled off an acre to Charlie Mina, who built a physical therapy clinic, again, health-related. He parceled off the back section of his property to Dr. Prinz, who built a podiatry clinic. And Dr. Prinz is now a Samaritan employee, but he still owns that clinic. Again, all health-related. In 1995, Jeff Metcalf and I split the property. I kept my clinic and parking lot, and he kept the area behind, which was eventually sold off to Dr. Chancellor in about 2005. And you have the plans there, and I highly agree with Dr. Chancellor's wishes, plans to build his dental office and 2 other office spaces that would have been probably single-story in a medical community. And the original plan you have in your things, and I'm still having a hard time with the interpretation of mixed use, and I agree with Municipal Code 17.52.240 that the dental office and office spaces were planned, but I don't think that a 3-story, 30-unit apartment complex was planned in 2005. And I do not believe that that facility is compatible with anything that was ever planned for this property. I think it's too many people. I mean, you can have up to 150 people living there if you have 2 and 3 or more people in this small footprint of space. And I don't believe that that was the original intent of this property. A couple of years ago, Dr. Ransom came by, the only time I've ever met him, and asked if I would be interested in purchasing the area directly behind his clinic, which would have been the northeast section. And I said, no, but if he ever was interested in selling the section directly behind my clinic, which would have been the southeast section, I could be interested if that was reasonable. I never heard from him or have spoken with him again. I'm also concerned, back with Municipal Code 17.08, again, the facilities were not planned together. And I think that the negative impact on the neighborhood is considerable. And I would challenge any of you to want this facility built directly behind your business or directly behind where you live. I spend more hours at my office there than I do at home. And it feels like if there's a 3-story, 30-unit apartment complex there, I'm not going to get my work done, and there's too much noise and distraction. I've lived in apartments. I know how noisy they are. I know the drama that happens, positive and negative. And I certainly would support, you know, maybe smaller scale, shorter buildings, something that's more compatible with homes or living spaces for medical care personnel. I've been on the State Rural Health Coordinating Council, and recruitment and retention are huge. And definitely, yes, we do need housing in this place, in this town, but let's be reasonable and considerate of our neighbors, as the first speaker spoke. Let's be creative and find other things available. But this property, I think that that's just too much to be built on that small footprint. And I'm done talking.
Just going to jump in real quick because I know that we have a time limit.
Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Lauren Robertson, and I'm one of the neighbors of Northeast West Devils Lake Road. So I think, kind of picking up what Ms. Portwood just said, I think we'd like to start by saying we're not debating the need for housing in Lincoln County or Lincoln City. We know that the need is there. But such housing needs to be developed responsibly and in accordance with the Lincoln City Municipal Code. And that is the reason that we're here today, is because there are numerous provisions within the site plan that do not comply with the Lincoln City Municipal Code. The one thing that I would actually just like to highlight, I know Ms. Portwood talked a little bit about the mixed-use development. I think the one thing that I'd like to highlight just in that argument, again, is that the city relies on this being an amendment by citing 1752-240K. What that refers to is it refers to a change in the location of or amount of land devoted to a specific use of the site. And so again, when we're talking about when we look at a use of a site, it's how that land is intended to be developed. And in the 2005 plan, that plan was developed for office spaces, as Ms. Portwood has gone through and described. So again, that's one of our points regarding the mixed-use development. In any event, the 3 things that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this evening are about which zone applies, discussion about the parking, and then the final thing is just a comment about just the site plan process in general. And so the first thing, going to which zone applies. As you can see up here, we've got the zoning provision for the professional campus zone. What the city has said is that this development is entitled to a reduction in parking because there's elderly housing units in the facility. Now, as we go through and we look at this, the city is correct. Elderly housing units are something that can be included in professional campus zoning. But what the city hasn't done is said the complete statement within that. And so when we look in professional campus zoning, elderly housing units developed under the standards and provisions of the low-density section of the multifamily residential zone are permitted in the professional campus zone. Now, this is important because I know as you've gone through and reviewed the site plan, you've seen that the professional campus zoning provisions have been applied to every aspect of the site plan. That's incorrect. That should not have happened if the justification for elderly housing is here. And again, that's another thing. This is not to say that we don't want elderly housing. I think elderly housing should be included in this apartment complex if it's permitted to move forward. But what the city code recognizes is that when elderly housing units are developed, they need to be developed in a way that's sensitive to the needs of elders. And I'm sorry I keep using that term. I hate that term too. But that it needs to be developed that way, because what we see with professional campus zoning is that this is high-density zoning. This is zoning where buildings can be higher than they can be in any other zone. And multifamily residential zoning, that's not the case. And so again, when we're going through and we're talking about what zoning provision has been applied to the site plan, that was something that was incorrectly done on this approval. So the second point that I'd like to go through and talk a little bit about is parking. So parking in this case, there's just a significant parking shortage. And the thing that's hard to address with this, as you've seen from our written materials and the supplemental letter that we've submitted, is that it's hard to gauge the exact number of how short that parking shortage is. In this case, we don't have how many employees currently work for Dr. Ransom included on any of the site plan or any of the materials that have been submitted. And that's important because one of the ways that you determine the required number of parking spaces is based on the square footage of a building as well as the amount of employees. And so here we don't know that number. And what's important about that is that the city has said that that's 26 spots. In the builder's response to our appeal, they replied and said, well, actually, there's going to be 27 spots that are required just for that demo facility. So again, there's a disconnect on how many number of parking places is actually just required for that demo facility. And then when we get into the issue of whether elder housing units are included or how that parking is included, that number, the parking shortage goes up from 7 or 8 to 14, 13 or 14. I think, and I'm summarizing this quickly because I am very focused on the time. And we've included this in our written materials. But it's an important point to go through and look at just how many parking spaces have been required and how that parking arrangement has been met. The other thing that I would note is we haven't received any notice about this, but in the planning meeting, what happened as far as just figuring out a way that the emergency vehicle for fire could turn around in the facility was the reduction of another parking space. We haven't been given any other notice about how that's changed in the original approved plan, or if there was some other agreement that was made with the builder. But again, so the city's assessment that it's only 7 places short is incorrect. It's at least 8 spaces short. Depending on the number of employees that work for Dr. Ransom, it could be even higher than that. Then we have the fire chief, and then you see how these numbers keep adding up. And so again, this is something that just shouldn't be approved retroactively, I think is our main point. And the other thing that I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is the idea of a shared parking agreement. And so in this case, it seems that the city and the builder have mistakenly assumed that LCMC 1756-070 applies. And when you look at this code provision, you can see that there can be a shared parking agreement when there's been some sort of showing that the uses of the facilities complement each other. But what's important about this is when you look at the first sentence there, it says for a single building or a single parcel of land. In this case, it isn't a single building, it isn't a single parcel of land. And so what that means is that, that this provision applies. And so this is 1756-060. Now what's important when you go through and you read that provision is that it doesn't give the planning director discretion to do a shared parking agreement based on complementary use of the facilities. What that provision says is that the parking facilities, the use of the parking facilities do not overlap in time. You don't see the subsequent language about giving the planning director discretion to do a joint parking arrangement, and you don't see the language in there that talks about complementary use. So in this case, or in the site plan, it's our position that a shared parking agreement isn't permissible, just based on looking at those two things. Excuse me for a moment. I think the last point that we'd like to kind of talk about as far as the shared parking agreement is that the city has suggested that a parking study could be completed to show, again, that there's this complementary use of the facilities. But the problem that we have with the parking study and the problem that we have with parking is that this has been an issue that the neighbors have raised from the beginning. It's been an issue that Ms. Portwood has raised from the beginning. Because as you can see, and as you were told by Mr. Townsend, there's no parking off of West Devils Lake Road. You know, where the parking is going to go, it's going to go in front of those residential homes. And so,
Can you sum up this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the problem, the issue that we have with that, again, is that this is something that is going to directly affect the neighbors or surrounding neighbors. And this isn't something that the city should be able to foreclose our opportunity to be involved in, because saying that a parking study can be completed after the site plan approval and that this parking agreement can be completed after a site has been approved doesn't give the community the ability to respond to that. And I'd also just ask that you refer to the written arguments that we submitted, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, do we have any questions for? For the appellants, any questions? I would like you to review for me, because you went very quickly, the issue on the elderly housing and why you think your argument there.
So this is, we actually included kind of more of this argument in the letter that was submitted from September 3rd, or dated September 3rd. I think you received it today. But when we're talking about elderly housing units, the city in its response said that the definition of complex, an elder housing complex, doesn't apply to this case, so you don't even have to look at that provision, because according to the city, elderly housing units, as described in this code, it basically says elder housing units that you see in subsection F right up there on that code provision. It's far away for you to see, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't read it. Yeah.
So I will read it directly to you. So it says elderly housing units developed under the standards and provisions of the low-density section of the multifamily residential zone. Now, the thing that it seems like we're splitting hairs, but the issue that we raised was that this didn't qualify as an elderly housing complex because 85% of the housing wasn't devoted for elder housing, which is required under code. The city in its response said that it doesn't matter if it's a complex in the professional campus zoning, because the professional campus zoning says that you can have elderly housing units, which is what this provision says. So it says units. But our argument is that even with, so if you're going to look at that and look at elder housing units, then the zoning provision that's been applied to this case, the professional campus zoning, is incorrect, because the zoning that's contemplated in the professional campus zoning for elder housing units is multifamily residential zoning. I said that again very fast, and I apologize for that. Did that answer your question?
I'm getting it, I think.
I spoke very quickly. So it's, again, I mean, the issue is if you're going to include elder housing units in the professional campus zone, you need to apply the multifamily residential zoning, and the site plan approval doesn't apply that zoning. So that's one of the issues that we have there.
Thank you.
And our other issue was that this isn't a complex because it doesn't meet 85%, and that was within our written appeal.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. Yeah. And we'll now have the applicant's presentation, and you will have 15 minutes.
Good evening, Commissioners.
Please introduce yourself and speak directly into the
sorry.
microphones.
I am Nathan Knott. Go ahead, Alan.
My name's Alan Storm.
I'm a resident of Lincoln City, owner of Knotworks Construction. I'm the builder and partner in the proposed workforce housing project you'll be hearing about. I would like to start with some additional information on this project and some background on myself and my construction company. I've lived in Lincoln City all my 42 years and was born at North Lincoln Hospital across the street from the project. I've seen many changes and development over the years in Lincoln City, but one aspect of construction and development that has not changed, or rarely seen change, is affordable workforce housing. There's a shortage of affordable workforce housing throughout Oregon, especially on the Oregon coast and Lincoln City. This type of construction is very difficult to construct this here for numerous reasons, but also including the high cost of land, difficulty of construction associated with steep and sloped lots, costs of permits and system development charges, and rising construction costs throughout the industry. Myself and our team are trying to overcome the difficulties of building affordable workforce housing in Lincoln City, provide nice, clean, and safe housing communities for people who would like to live and work in Lincoln City. We feel this project fits the need of Lincoln City and fits well with the surrounding mixed community, including the hospital, small businesses, multifamily complexes, and single-family homes that are all found around this area. We have planned and designed this project with the local neighborhood in mind by keeping the total density of units lower than the city code allows, separating buildings from one another, creating adequate recreational area, provided more than double the required landscaping per the city's code. We also provided more full-size parking spaces compared to compact parking spaces required by the city. Our team has put a lot of effort to try and create a quiet, comfortable community that goes far and above Lincoln City's minimum municipal code that works well with the surrounding neighborhood. I also spent some time at the site plan review meeting listening to the concerns of the neighbors who voiced their concerns and recommendations. These voices did not go unheard and will be taken into consideration when building. We have worked extensively with the City Planning and Public Works Department to make sure this project aligned with the city's municipal code, that our overall project and design was conforming and it was a good fit for the community and the shortage of the city's housing needs. As I've stated previously, we have designed this project above the city code minimum to make this a more desirable community for both the tenants who live there and also the surrounding neighbors. As owner-builder, we will participate in active management and maintenance role, and we also will be hiring a property manager for the complex. We are doing our best to create something that is very much needed in Lincoln City and also the general community near North Lincoln Hospital. It is our intention to provide housing for the elderly who would like to have the security of living within walking distance of their health care providers, provide for employees of Samaritan North Lincoln Hospital, and any others who are just trying to find a nice, clean, safe place for themselves, their family, at a reasonable cost. I would also like to thank Planning Department and Public Works for the amount of work they put into preparing this meeting.
Nathan, thank you. I'm a real estate attorney and land use attorney, and Nathan asked me to come here to help assist in some of the discussion regarding the questions of the planning administrator's interpretation of the code. Big picture, I think the staff report, in particular supplemental staff report, does a really nice job of laying out the issues, the code sections that are relevant, and reasonable interpretation. Speaking to just a couple of the comments regarding the mixed-use zone, I would ask the commissioners to think through the consequences of the interpretation that's being asked to be adopted by the opposition and the appellants. Big picture, they believe that because there was a land division in 2005 and a building was constructed, that mixed-use development on this property is forever barred. The only means that I think that they potentially would concede to agreeing that mixed-use development would be allowed is if you completely demoed the existing office building. Otherwise, they're trying to say, well, you know, you didn't do it in 2005, so you can't do it now. It's been too long. It wasn't developed together. It can never be developed together. The planning director has explained, well, what we have is we have a current site plan review modification request before you right now for the entirety of the property. It's all under one ownership. It's all subject to the jurisdiction of the Planning Commission in the city. It's all going to be subject to conditions of approval that are applied, that are, if adopted, will run with the land. So it is, under the plain text reading, you know, being developed together, and the fact that that the building in 2005 was constructed, and now we have a modification of the site plan. Those are kind of timing requirements that are not in the code, that are being asked to be written into the code. And that would be inconsistent with how courts would review an interpretation. One of the questions I heard from the commissioners is, how do we enforce some of these things that we're hearing about? Whether it be, if you say you're going to set 5 units aside for housing for elderly occupants, or you say you're going to have shared use parking. The conditions of approval, they do run with the land. As a condition of approval, we have to do a joint shared parking agreement, and that's going to be recorded. So the owner of the property, prior to issuance of building permits, needs to record that agreement, and it will bind the entirety of the property. It'll create access easements between the existing development area and the area that's currently undeveloped, but will be ultimately the site of the apartments. So the city additionally can be made a party to one of those declarations. You know, you can say, insert a paragraph that says that the city is a benefited party, that it cannot be amended without the prior consent of the city. So there are a lot of tools in the toolkit that the city has in order to enforce the conditions of approval that are being discussed tonight. One of the conditions of approval regarding shared use, I guess there was a question. The dental office had a original maximum number of employees at 7. I've spoken with the property owner, and he assures me they have no more than 6 employees, including the dentist, working on site. So to the extent that that evidence wasn't included in the record, I disagree with that there wasn't, but those are those numbers for you now. Planning staff's worked with those before, and they're reflected in the supplemental findings and the existing findings. One thing I'd like to speak to additionally is just the application of the parking standards sections. You know, if you visualize the code, you got a chart. Chart lists a lot of different kinds of uses, and that's where we find a lot of the numbers that are being cited tonight. But I want to read to you section H. It says, other uses not specifically listed above shall furnish parking as required by the planning director. In determining the off-site parking requirements for said uses, the planning director shall use the above requirements as a general guide and shall determine the minimum number of parking spaces required to avoid undue interference with the public use of streets and alleys. So what we're asking for is a mixed-use development, and you don't find that expressly in that chart. This isn't, you know, the exact interpretation that's reflected in the staff report, but this is an alternative that I think is also reasonable way to look at it, and just say this is an application, straightforward application of the parking standards, where the planning director has looked at the various uses that are contemplated within the mixed-use development, and uses using this source material to come up with the standard that he thinks is appropriate. And so this is an instance when I think the Planning Commission has discretion, and you're being asked to take a very narrow, conservative review over the application of the parking standards that I don't think is necessary. So, you know, again, I think the only thing you need to do is adopt the findings as proposed by the planning director. I just wanted to raise that supplemental argument as I thought it was relevant. am I doing on time? Nathan, if you would, just describe, with the 30 units, how many of those units are intended to be available to the tenants under your typical lease terms, and how many you expect to have on-site visitor parking?
Well, the on-site visitor parking, for leases, we, on other projects that we have, or we have a lease that is signed and you're allowed one vehicle per unit. The rest of the spots after the one vehicle per unit or one space per unit is saved for visitor parking. So I know that was a question that was brought up on the parking standards. I think from our experience, the parking that's being brought up by the appellant in our other site does not seem to be an issue whatsoever. The parking during the day is very wide open. Most people that live, and I'm speaking of the apartments that are next to Bimart here in Lincoln City. Most of those, I would say, a significant number of spots are empty during the day, which works well with the shared parking agreement that we're proposing on our site plan review.
And so as an additional condition of approval, the plan director spoke about, having a parking study, and it can be very narrow. I mean, we believe that any kind of parking study of the subject properties is going to determine that there are adequate access sites on site associated with the dental office. The deficiency, if you use that term, for the overall site plan was 7 units. So trying to determine, is there really 7 open spaces in a typical day? Well, we believe there is. But additionally, we can provide evidence, as Nathan has said, that a typical apartment doesn't have full parking during normal business hours, and that when you're seeing the high numbers of visitors, that's evenings and weekends. So the evidence that you have tonight is that we believe satisfying a condition of approval like that is very easy and is quite feasible. It can be done not in subjective standards, but in very concrete standards. We have to come up with a parking study that shows that there is a capacity of 7 sites on the dental office, and if not on the dental office, we need to give evidence that, on a typical day, there's at least 7 sites open in similar parking areas. So that's not an application of substantial amount of discretion or anything like that to where we think it's appropriate for conditional use. Those were the primary issues raised. We do have Mr. Belmonte here as well if there's specific questions over the site plan. I see the light blinking, so I'll wrap up my comments, and if there's questions, kind of legal interpretation questions, I'm happy to take a stab at it. If you have questions about the operation, please direct those toward Nathan, and if you have some technical site plan review calculation standards, Mr. Belmonte can come up and speak to those items.
Any questions, Commissioners?
Yes.
Commissioner Cron?
So it's your contention that the original plan that included 3 office buildings is mixed use. My understanding, mixed use is commercial and residential. So what part of that original plan was residential?
It's my contention that the application today, which is a modification, is an application for mixed use. So the application before this commission
Was not mixed use.
No, the application before the commission here in 2017 is for a modification of a prior site plan review. The application that you have jurisdiction over today is a mixed-use application.
Right, and it's presented to us as an amendment, correct, to an original application that was not mixed use.
That's right.
Mr. Knott, you started your comments by calling this workforce housing project. Why did you include seniors in it if it's for workforce housing?
Well, overall workforce housing, but as I stated, also elderly housing in there also, because of the close proximity to the hospital, works really well.
Did it have anything to do with the lack of parking available?
No.
Why 3 stories?
Because 3-story apartments work well with the way we can design it for the land that's available there. And there's no reason to go not 3 stories compared to 2 stories in my mind.
Density?
But we're not to the density standard. that we
My
could
understanding,
be-
there isn't a density standard for this zoning area, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Yes, so we could be way more than 30 units.
Sure, you could build, according to the PC height requirement, you could go up to 45 feet.
Correct. But we're not.
Okay, so that was my question. So why 3 stories and not 2 stories?
Because we can make the affordable housing work, we can build affordable housing on this land to provide workforce affordable housing by doing it 3 stories.
Are you getting some sort of subsidies
Absolutely
for calling it affordable housing?
No, this is,
So the assumption is that this would not be attractive to higher income folks? Maybe if it were less dense?
I think it would be harder to rent, and that is more of a, we're trying to provide workforce housing, not higher income earning housing on this project.
Can I ask a question? Sure. Because this was brought up, if you were to build a 2-story apartment complex, reduce your numbers accordingly, what would be the price increase in the rent? Do you have a number for that?
I don't have a number off the top of my head. I know it.
I could just speak. I've been involved either on the real estate end or the land use end through the development of over 900 apartment units the last couple of years, and it doesn't work like that, if I can be so bold. You know, you got to go ahead and make projects pencil. They either do or they don't. And I haven't been associated with any 2-story apartment projects that pencil and that get greenlit and get financing. So while I can appreciate some of this line of questioning and exploring and say, well, what could you do? That's, at some point, those questions are just academic, because the applicant has got a project that they believe in, that they can get financing, that they can bring to the table. But speculating, well, would something else work, isn't necessarily appropriate inquiry.
I guess you're missing the direction I'm going for.
Okay.
Because here in Lincoln City, we have terms like affordable housing that isn't affordable to anybody that's got a job in Lincoln City. And we have low income that doesn't really meet the bill. So what I'm trying to ask is, if you bring down from 3 stories to 2, how much more rent would it cost, and thereby how much less affordable does it become?
Thank you.
That's the direction I'm asking the question from.
Yeah, and that's hard. I think it's hard to answer that question with any asking a number or telling you a number with that statement.
But the only thing you can say is, I mean, the price of land doesn't change. Right. And the price of, what would be some of the variables that would change some of the variables that wouldn't?
So obviously,
Commissioner Cunningham.
Obviously the price of land, a few more, if you get over a certain point, it brings the cost down to build. There is a threshold that if you do 15 and you're paying a certain amount of money for land, it just doesn't pencil. You can't get any kind of financing through a bank to fund you for the project. And we're not asking for government subsidies, state subsidies, help from the city. We're not asking for a reduced rate. We're doing this on our own to provide exactly what I've stated was workforce housing, affordable workforce housing.
I like when you use the term affordable, that I keep dropping to the question, well, what is the rent for a three-bedroom apartment, a one-bedroom apartment? What makes that affordable? What is the number that you're associating with the rent?
So basically, a starting number is about $950 for a two-bedroom apartment, and it goes up from there. And
it goes
the way
to
we,
where?
excuse me?
It goes up to where?
At this point, it goes up to $1,150, somewhere in that range for a three-bedroom, two-bath. But it depends on the unit, too. I mean, it could depend on brand-new construction, depend on lower floor, upper floor, end units with windows, a lot of different things, amenities.
So when you did your financing with the bank, did they ask for a mean income that you'll be generating from each unit?
No, they asked for everything under the sun, but I guess we are working our numbers off of what we have found to be affordable in Lincoln City and what rents and what does not.
So anywhere from $900 for a one-bedroom up to $1,100 for a three-bedroom?
Approximately. I mean, it can go up to
Third floor,
$1,150.
second floor.
Yes, sure. Lots of different, a lot of different options there.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because I kept trying to figure out what is affordable.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, affordable is affordable to who, right? I mean, but it's the market, we're trying to present something that just about everybody with a job can find a house to rent or a roof over their heads.
Commissioner Schlesinger?
I wondered, because this is affordable housing, are you giving any energy efficient type of things, extra insulation, perhaps Energy Star appliances, something like that?
Not on appliances, but we have to abide by the city's code on some energy efficient code for building structures.
So code built isn't as good as Earth Advantage, for example?
Probably not. I'm not familiar with that, but I know that the city's codes have become pretty energy efficient.
Thank you.
You mentioned that density is not a part of the PC zone, and recreational set-aside is not either, but you're planning on recreational space for the apartments? Is that, how much, and does that include landscaping, or is it separate from the landscaping?
So the way Gene...
In addition to the landscaping?
Yeah, it's two separate. We have the numbers figured, and Gene could probably attest to that and give us some numbers. If we could get the site plan back up here, we can probably, or Gene can describe it a little bit for us.
Deb, I closed mine, so.
Hi, I'm Gene Belanti. I am the architect for the project. The city code requires open space for each unit, private open space, and then it also requires common open space. So I believe for each unit, I think it's 48 square feet or 64 square feet.
It's the recreation space is 250 square feet per unit. The landscape area, other than that, is it's just a function of the size of the property.
So within our units, we provided private decks for each unit, and then there's also some common space that's spread around that's usable. And the common space the private decks total 1,600 square feet, and the open area is roughly 6,800 square feet.
How much?
6,800.
So the private decks are considered recreational use?
Correct. So at 250 square feet for 30 units is roughly 7,500 square feet. And then in addition to designating the private area and the open area, there is also landscaping that's on top of that, which is another 21,000 square feet.
2,100?
But we don't designate that as open area, it's just landscaping.
2,100 or 20?
21,337 square feet.
What percentage of the property is that?
That is 35.5%.
Mr. Chair, I need to correct something that I said. Actually, for a mixed-use development, there is no requirement for the private recreation area, for recreation areas. So the 250 square feet per unit does not apply in a mixed-use development. It only applies for...
No, I understand that, but they are applying it, correct? They
Right,
seem
I just want to
yes.
make it clear that it's not required.
Every unit should have a deck.
So there's one Exhibit B called Adapted Site Plan. Is that the most recent plan?
It's one of your attachments.
It's one of your attachments. It's Exhibit B, Adapted Site Plan. It shows a play area over the storm water detention area, if that helps.
That was,
Oh,
Yeah, it's
What page?
packet
The
page
pack-
63. A lot of numbers on here.
So that's not really a request.
yeah, that play area that's shown over the storm area isn't, that isn't current.
That isn't current.
No.
Okay, so the play area that is, let's see if I can get my directions correct here, on the northeast corner of the property, is that an,
Actually, if you look at the site plan, it's the hatched area.
okay,
And if you can see play area, I can't turn it.
Did you point it out, or?
probably click on it here.
Uh-huh.
We need to...
Excuse me, we're not getting this information out to
Can't
the
get this in the
audience.
record,
I don't
so.
believe. If
You
we
have
could-
to speak into the microphones in order for us
Yeah,
to...
this is Alan Storm again, just that Exhibit B was previously refreshed. This is just comments for the purpose of the record that Commissioner Crone spoke to. It was a demonstrative aid attached to a letter trying to show that if needed, you could attach, the property was large enough to attach an additional small office space. So that's why you may be wondering, well, why is there a non-current, exhibit that was part of your planning materials? And there's some context to that. In the letter that I had provided, it was just a demonstrative aid. It was not requested as an amended site plan, and the context of the letter clearly states out that. So while I totally understand, Commissioner, why you grab it, you're customary to say that's what I want, I would point you to the site plan that's on the screen and in the staff report.
yeah, I'm just trying to understand which is the most relevant one.
Absolutely. I just wanted to clear that up for the record. If that was the one that was attached to my letter, no. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you very much. Thank you. Commissioners, before we begin the public testimony part, how about a 5-minute break? Take a 5-minute break.
It's, I think it's the same.
So we're now live? Okay, the meeting is reconvening at 8 p.m., and it's now time for public testimony, and I'm going to call you in the order of the two sheets that I received. I don't know which one is sheet 1 and which one is sheet 2, so I'm just going to start with the one that's on top. Angie Wright. So please state your name and talk directly into the microphone so all of us can hear you, and so can the viewing audience at home.
My name is Angie Wright. I heard about this issue a couple of weeks ago, and along with a few friends, we looked into what was going on and what was being proposed. We're residents of East Devils Lake, but we're moving to Jetty, Southeast Jetty Avenue. So the traffic on East Devils Lake, the traffic on West Devils Lake also does directly influence me. I read the staff report. I read the report from the appellant, and I read quite a few of the documents that were provided online. Through my experience with project development in the Coos Bay area as a legal attorney, a legal secretary, and a project manager, I didn't see where I could add more than the staff report added. But as you guys have brought up, the workforce housing, you've brought forth the effect of the traffic, and areas on the own appellant's letter that they brought up that they've been longtime residents here. They've annexed the property several times. Nobody's done anything with the property, and nobody's doing anything with housing. And if somebody can come in and put housing into that area and it works with your project development, I would urge you to strongly take any sense of emotion or long-term, this is my right to have this here. If we're just going to play that this is not my neighborhood and nobody wants an apartment complex in their neighborhood, we need to take that out of the conversation. As my husband is a 100% disabled veteran, we were transferred to Lincoln City in 2009. We had 2 weeks to find housing, or we were sleeping in our car. He had to report to work. We were very fortunate to get housing on East Devils Lake Road. We've been renting there ever since in the price range that Nathan Knott described. Our housing has gone down. The owners have passed away, and we need to find housing. I could not find housing in this area. I became a teacher full-time so that I can make up the money to find housing as my husband's health deteriorated and he lost his job with Weimar. As I said, he's now 100% disabled. We cannot find housing. I had to purchase a house at the lowest level I could possibly find that I, as a single person, could maintain with our income and our ability. If there were units where, as a professional, I could rent an apartment, that would be fantastic. I've been urged by several friends to speak on behalf of them. We have an employee at our school that moved here. She could not get the job until she had housing. Her husband is a professional accountant in Pacific City. They have been renting from these apartments, and they recently just purchased a home. There's many people that get transferred to this town as professionals, working people. My kids play sports. We're involved in the community. Just because you hear the word affordable housing, put this face onto it. There's no drugs, there's no alcohol, there's no loud parties. My son's car is loud. But when you say affordable housing, I've seen each one of you kind of say affordable housing. This is the face of affordable housing.
Thank you very much. Alan Sarum? Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
It might be helpful for the people who speak to address what criterion they're talking to.
Right. Just to remind you that this evening, the matter at issue is the determination of the appropriateness of the director's interpretation of the requirements of the code. I think everybody in this room recognizes the need for more housing and more affordable housing in Lincoln City. So that's really not the basic issue tonight. The basic issue is whether the director interpreted the code correctly in approving this site plan. So please speak, try to limit your testimony to the objective criteria that we have to review in making our decision tonight. Thank you. Nathan Knott, you already spoke. Christine Han? Han? Yeah.
I'm Christine Hahn, and I've lived here for 26 years, and I live in one of the apartments that they're planning. I live by Weimar, and I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the parking thing that keeps coming up. I would urge you to drive through there. There's not a parking issue. There's almost double what they're planning now and where I live at. I've lived in a single dwelling on Holmes Road, and I've had more drama and crime when I lived on Holmes Road than I do now. I feel safe there. I'm a single parent, and I don't see any more police traffic. Traffic is not an issue whatsoever. I have Mondays and Tuesdays off, and like they said, there's not even half of the parking lot is full on Mondays and Tuesdays. So the shared parking thing, I mean, you can talk to our Weimar, you can talk to the mall. We don't park over there, that we don't need to. I have 2 cars, and we have a assigned parking spot, and we have no problem finding another place to park. People come see me if they don't have problems. So the parking issue I really don't see, and the traffic. But I pull out, the only thing that I have to stop for is usually a bus for the school. So I don't see that that's really an issue. And these properties are very well maintained. The stuff that they use to build it, I have granite countertops. I have hardwood laminate. It's really nice. And I could not afford a house if it wasn't for this. So I know it's not about affordable living, but it is. The traffic and the crime and the drama is not a problem for me. I had as much in my home. So,
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So you live in a 2-bedroom apartment?
I live in a 3-bedroom.
A 3-bedroom apartment? Are you on the 3rd floor?
I'm on the bottom floor because I have a disabled child. She's autistic, and she's very heavy-footed, and she has mobility issues at times. So we have an ADA compliant apartment.
And do you use the handicap?
No, because she doesn't drive. And she could get to our house because it's right there. My spot's right in front of my house. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Leslie Ogden?
Hello, I'm Leslie Ogden. I'm the CEO of Samaritan North Lincoln Hospital. Incidentally, I'm also a homeowner in this exact same neighborhood. I live 3 blocks north of the hospital at the corner, a little off the corner of Holmes and West Devils Lake. Of course, I'm going to tell you about workforce housing and the need. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I find no problem with the interpretation of the director here. I believe all things that have been raised are of concern. I think they've been sorted out. I think that a lot of this is not in my backyard, and I have very many friends and neighbors who are sitting right here. I just have to disagree with them because there is a more important need here, and that is if I can't find workforce housing for our healthcare professionals, it won't matter if I build a new hospital. It won't matter that we have new healthcare facilities here because we won't have anyone to take care of us because they can't afford to live in Lincoln City. And I'm not talking about our doctors. I'm talking about the vast amount of people who work for me who make about $75,000 a year or less. These are technical people. These are professionals. They have degrees, but they can't afford to live here. And unless we can make a change, by adopting good projects. You know, what's the point? If we keep saying no, not in my backyard. Again, follow the code, do what you've got to do, answer the questions, solve the problems, but get us some housing for our professionals, please. That's my appeal. Thank you.
Yeah. Meg Portwood? Nope, okay. Mindy Landry?
Hi, I'm Mindy Landry.
Please speak directly into the phone, yeah. Into the microphone.
I'm currently managing 2 apartment complexes in Lincoln City, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the parking. Christy already talked a little bit about it, but during the daytime, 90% of the cars are gone. People are working. I drive through the parking lot at night. There doesn't seem to be any issues with that at that time. I mean, of course, the parking lot's full because everybody's home, but that's what the parking spots are there for. And then you guys talked a little bit about boat and trailer parking. That is prohibited in our complexes. There's no trailer parking, boat parking. And I won't talk about the need because obviously you guys don't want to hear about that, but I will say that I get 40 plus emails a day when I have an ad online, and I actually have to pull them at times because I can't keep up with the inquiries. It's impossible. So anyway, do you have any questions?
Do you live on site?
I do not.
Have friends that live on site?
Yeah, actually, a lot of the tenants are my friends. Small town.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, John Bethiel? They have gone home. John? Is there a John here? Daryl Prinz?
Dr. Daryl Prinz. I'm a podiatrist. I have one of the buildings adjacent to the property that was mentioned earlier. The address is 3011 Northeast West Devils Lake Road. I have a very specific concern, and that is regarding drainage. It looks like the proposed development has eliminated the drainage pond that's there, or at least made it smaller. And in the past, there has been standing water on my property that had to do with drainage on adjacent properties. And I'm very concerned about how that would affect the drainage of my property.
Is your property south of this development?
Yes.
You can't point to that.
Yeah. I believe it's directly south.
Okay. And it fronts West Devils Lake Road?
So Charlie Mina's physical therapy office is directly on West Devils Lake Road, and I'm behind him.
Here we go.
Yes, right there.
That's
yes.
And
And
where
so
is
that,
it?
right in this area, right here, is where the drainage pond is. And if you saw on the earlier site plan, the drainage pond is fairly large, and I believe the new site plan covers up that drainage pond. And so my concern is how that will affect the water, because I believe my property is lower. And in the past, when we built the property originally was 1997, and I believe 1999, 2000, we had some pretty high rain years, and we did have some standing water right in that area that almost encroached into our crawl space under the building.
Any questions for?
Has any, oops,
Go ahead, Patty.
has any, has any of this been designated wetland? Has it been mapped?
There's no designated wetlands there.
Commissioner Bryson?
Did you get notice of the zoning change?
I was notified, yes.
How long ago was that?
I believe it was in July.
And did you have concerns at that time? Did you make your concerns known if you did?
So I did go to the neighborhood meeting, but I didn't make any other concerns. I didn't make any other notification.
When you built your place, were you under the impression that it was always going to be zoned commercial for medical buildings?
Yes.
And was that part of your decision at that time?
Well, yes, but my building did predate, the construction of my building predated the construction of the dental office.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tina French.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. My name is Tina French. I own North Lincoln Sanitary Service, and I am a landlord, and I am a minor investor in the apartments over by Bimart. I am here to tell you that, similar to Mindy's testimony, the last vacancy I had at one of our single-family residences, I had 30 applications in 5 days, and I had to close the application process at that. In the past 2 years, hiring employees, especially technical employees that have to come from out of our area, has become increasingly hard because they can't find a place to live here. And we're talking again similar to what Leslie Ogden said in the $60,000 to $75,000 range. We can't hire them because they can't live here, and commuting is too onerous on their families. And I know that story is not news to any of you, but I think it bears repeating because, similar to earlier testimony, if we keep pushing things off because people don't want them in their backyards, housing is just going to go higher. And pretty soon, we're not going to be able to afford a place to live. And we all had our houses. And what if people would have came and testified against us when we built our houses?
I would advise you, please speak to the applicable criteria that we'll need to evaluate to make our decision tonight.
So the applicable criteria is this property zoned for this unit? And I think it's been proven pretty well that it has. And I think that the things that have been brought up are persnickety things, and I think that they do need addressed and talked about. Traffic as being one of them. If those were office buildings, the traffic would be significantly increased during the day versus apartment buildings. You have 15 to 30-minute appointments where traffic coming and going from 3 different office buildings versus 30-unit apartment buildings. It's significantly higher if it's an office building. Single-family residences don't require visitor parking. I don't understand why we would require visitor parking for apartment buildings. If I want to build a 10-bedroom house, I think when you said it tonight, I need 2 parking spots. So I don't know why it would be more for an apartment building. And then regarding previous testimony tonight about apartments behind businesses and not being able to get work done, I have 3 units behind my business, 3 different complexes, and they don't interfere with our daily business at all. They're not noisy. They've been there for a very long time, not as long as our business has, but once in a while we get foot traffic, but they're respectable, nice people. We don't have any issues. I have more issues with the bus stop in front of my office causing really bad problems than I've ever had with an apartment complex around my business.
Any questions for?
Thank you.
Thank you. Jean Volante? Finished. Okay. Jim Sullivan?
I taught Nathan and that. I've been here for 52 years. My concern is the traffic. I think it's a great project. I live in the neighborhood, lived there 48 years. My concern is all of you could work very well there because every day I walk 6 to 8 miles in that area all the time. I'm retired, 19 years. There's all kinds with the addition of the from the ocean to the thing, that big sidewalk we put in that you could drive a car, it's excellent. But the amount of people that are walking there, you have no clue. So you wanted to know if you need an eye in the sky, I can tell you how many people from the apartments that they built back in '95 go through there. On one side of the road, when there's no road where the hospital has no sidewalk on that side, you can't walk. So everybody got to go across the highway. So you got all these cars coming through. So you got a lot of people using the thing. My concern is only that if the project goes
Please
through,
speak into the microphone. Yeah.
yeah, if the project goes through, and our neighborhood, that it's done in a way that we're taking care of, there's seniors, young little kids that are running around from the apartments. I see almost daily something that could possibly happen around that area. Now, with adding housing, which we need, obviously we need it, there's going to be more people. So all I'm saying is the city better have some kind of a plan to help the rest of us in the neighborhood, all the hospital people, all the seniors who are there, all the ones that are over here at work in the medical office. I see every day 20, 30 from the hospital walk past my house. Our neighborhood is the walking neighborhood to go through. It's nice, wonderful people. But I'm saying there's a concern. I don't know how many times I've had hit because when I try to walk across the road, and I walk fast, probably faster than anybody in this room, that I almost got hit because of the traffic, the speed of people coming through there. So whatever happens, because it sounds like something's possibly going to happen, that we got to make sure that the city's aware that there's a lot of people who walk, run, jog, and do things of that nature because of the wonderful facilities we have there. And you have with the elderly people, and they're having, I'm a senior, I'm 74 years old, but the thing is, even they are out there. So I hope when everybody's doing their fancy designing, coming up, trying to improve our city, try to make it better, as good a builder as you could find, great neighbors, I love them all. But somehow we better pay attention what the thing, because there's a problem for people walking. There's people walking, running, and everything every day. You have no clue how many people are around there.
Thank you so much.
I have a question for Mr. Sullivan. The intersection that you're talking about, is it mainly the homes in West Devils Lake intersection that seems to be a real problem, or all along there?
Just all along, because people come up, they come from the apartments, from all of the businesses that are there, the young ones that work want to stay healthy. We're all trying to stay healthy. You got to cross the road because there's no street along the West Devils Lake for a long ways there because of the hospital and the apartment buildings. So you have to cut across. If you walk the other way, you got the traffic behind you, and it slopes like this, okay? So what happens is that any place around there, you have to, if you want to get on the other side toward the lake, you got to cross the road, and you better be a road runner. That's all I'm saying. So there's a concern. My part is I've lived there for long years. I've lived Lincoln City 52. Most of the time you guys do a great job. Sometimes I don't like it. But overall, things are looking well. And my concern is I hope that somebody is looking out for all kinds of people, from little kids up to young people like me, and that you're going to have some plans to take for, there's going to be more people walking, more people driving, more people using that facility. And I've talked to them, which I always do.
Yeah,
They're
thank you
used
very
to it.
much. Yeah. Good. Any further questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sandor, and I'm not going to pronounce your last name. I'll let you do that.
My name is Sandor Brandsize, and stop laughing. Anyways, I have a problem with the drainage. All the water is going to wash down to my property. My property is directly to the west.
You speak right into the microphone so we can hear you.
My property is this one over here.
All right.
And anyways, and as far as the apartments concerned, I lived in apartments in Houston, Dallas, Oklahoma City, Elko, Nevada, and in California. And I tell you what, that's why I bought the property, just to get away from the noise. And I'm paying over $9,000 property tax just to, you know, that's why I built the house over there. So that's the gripe I have.
Any questions?
I have one. Do you think this is going to have effect on your property value?
You know, I don't know. That's a good question. Probably.
How do you access your property? Can you show me which road you come in?
Yeah, from the where from well, it's not on there. From Union Avenue.
Union, is that off Holmes
Off
Road?
of Holmes. That's the only way I can access it. Unless I want to climb a fence. I have no desire.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Are there anyone else wish to testify this evening, including representatives of public agencies? Now is your time to do so. Yes, please come forward.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amalia Green. I'm one of the neighbors. And I just wanted to bring out one point that I think might have gotten skipped in the presentation, which is that in this idea that the dentist's office parking can somehow absorb some of the parking from the apartment complex, my reading of that code, it says that in order to qualify for that kind of compromise agreement, the use of those two parking sections need to not to overlap in a point in time. So in this case, the housing units are used 24 hours. The dentist office is in operation during business hours. So to me, there's a clear 8-hour overlap there. So my common sense says that it just doesn't qualify for that. And my main concern as a neighbor really is the parking issue. There are a number of other apartment complexes in the general area, and if you go to them and you see there's side streets, they're usually filled with people parking there. And this plot does not have side streets. It just doesn't. People will be parking across the street if there's not sufficient for visitors or people who are, going to the dentist. So I just think common sense-wise, this particular plot is not appropriate for this level of development. I know that Mr. Na is looking at developing something on 36th Street that's very nearby. I don't take issue with that one because it's just a different nature of the lot, and we haven't seen the plans yet, frankly. But it seems to me that there are multiple developments in the works. There's also one at the Curtis Park area. And so this isn't, as some people have said, not in my backyard. There's plenty of development happening in my backyard. It's that this particular plot doesn't have parking to make the sort of compromise that the city's agreeing to make with the parking. And so I just want to make sure that that's taken into consideration. I also take issue with that it's 3 stories. If you wander around to the other apartment complexes in the neighborhood, they're 2 stories. There's nothing looming 3 stories in this whole area, and I understand that it seems like the code doesn't really limit that, but just, again, common sense with the aesthetics of the neighborhood, the general appearance of the neighborhood, and, you know, having invested in the neighborhood just a year ago, I am concerned about that impact on the appearance and my property value.
Any questions? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else like to testify? Yes. Speak into the microphone, please.
I'm Leanne Gabler. I'm also a homeowner just right in that neighborhood. I want to speak to, I think it was Sam, the gentleman who has the property directly behind. He didn't quite get his point across. He's talked before about the drainage issues on his property that are pretty severe and the flooding that occurs in his area because of that area, but it isn't about in our backyard. If any of you have walked back there and seen how tight that property is and what they're looking at putting in there, and Mr. Sullivan's right, the traffic has grown so fast, so quick, and people just fly down there like they're going on a freeway. We have children and elderly and other people up and down that street. So to put more cars right now, right there, seems really inappropriate. So we hope you look at all of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Wow, I get to sit down up here, huh? Okay, my name is Glenn Hillman, and I'm just at the north end of it. So the one higher end will be hitting me. And Sandy, which spoke before, is on my to my west. And when it rains, the property floods. And I have a rough time of going ahead and keeping water. That 99 type storm that hit bad, I mean, it got underneath the crawl space and everything. And most of it kind of rolls down. It helps me. Some of it rolls. The house in front of me gets a lake every time it rains. If it rains, even this year, some of the late rains we had, there was 6, 8, 10 inches of water that covered maybe 60 yards by, probably about 60, 70 feet by maybe 50 feet wide, and I've even seen ducks swimming on it. So, and it happens every time it rains. It's kind of right behind the house in front of me at 33, I think it is, 31. Northeast Devil's Road, it kind of drops down right behind the house, and then when that builds up too high and it rains more, it floods down right alongside my house, and it's got underneath it, and then it flows back to Sandy's property to the west of the big section off the left side. Sandy owns that piece.
Speak into the microphone, please. Yeah.
So it floods all the time, and if this property is all taken and asphalted, where's the water going to go? And and it's going to flood down into Sandy's property too, and flood me and flood everything. So I just thought I'd throw that 2 cents worth in. Anybody want to ask any questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I do. I have a question. I have a question. Can you point with the mouse which house is yours? I think I know which one you're.
Can you do it on the computer? Is there a mouse there?
You mean my computer, the computer right
Yeah.
now? Okay. If you have a say-so on it.
Right.
Right in there, yeah.
It's right there. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So, should have told me I know where the mouse is. Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. And it gets flooded. And just in front of me, up in this area, up in here, I don't see it okay, but just to the east of me, the house there, in their yard, it floods. That's where it floods bad. It's sort of like a lake when it rains. Every time it rains good, I don't know what it is. It might be a good like a clay-type basin or something, and it holds the water, and it takes quite a while for it to go down. So it picks up, once it picks up, it goes fast and floods.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to testify? All right, now's the time for rebuttal by the appellant, if any. You have 5 minutes. So just one of you will be speaking? Okay.
Great, and so I actually don't have very many additional.
Could you state your name, please?
Oh, I apologize. This is Lauren Robertson. I'm one of the neighbors from the Northeast West Devils Lake Road. And so I think you've heard from the neighbors that have talked a little bit about what's happened with flooding as well as the traffic in the area. And really, what I want to reiterate is the reason that we're here right now, again, is looking at the provisions of the code that haven't been applied correctly to this particular site development. As you've heard from our neighbors, we definitely understand that there is a need for housing in this community and don't dispute that, and are heartened to know that there are other developments that are happening in our same neighborhood that are developing the same way. So again, what we're talking about here, we've got the issues with the parking. I've written our arguments out about that. There is an overlap in time, and so based on what we have with the code's very clear on what's included or what is permissible with a shared parking agreement. And so given that overlap in time, we don't feel that a shared parking agreement is appropriate in this case. I think you've already heard all of our other arguments or have considered them that have been submitted in writing, and so really at this point I would just say thank you for your time, unless you have any further questions for me.
Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Now, is there a rebuttal by the applicant? You will have 5 minutes. Thank you. All right. Okay.
Can we ask questions of the applicant?
Shirley, if you'd like to come up.
Just keep in mind, if you're going to restart by asking questions, then you're going to be asking other people, do they want to comment?
All right.
The time for asking questions, the applicant was earlier, where people could hear and then react to it, and then, so just saying,
one question.
The appellant just sat down.
Well, to me, a lot of people brought up the drainage issue, and I'm not sure of the topographic area that's your building property in, but we do get a lot of rain here in Lincoln City, and that does seem to be a concern. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that in the future and have a plan for it?
Absolutely. So we've already hired a civil engineer. We've done a stormwater plan. We've sized the detention system, which is existing on site. So at this point, until we get final site plan, we don't know exactly if it needs to be enlarged or not. But if it does need to be enlarged per his engineered drawings and the approval of City Public Works, that's what will happen. Also, there is a detention pond on the, can I switch your spots here?
Yeah.
Real quick. So the size of the detention pond over here is the same size as what it was shown on the original site plan. The building is not encroaching on it. There's also another detention swale that runs along the backside here that we're going to keep intact. And after talking with the civil engineer, it's actually at this point not being sized in the detention system because it's not needed. But I'm going to keep it behind there to try to alleviate any runoff. And we will do our best working with the civil engineer to make sure there's no runoff onto the neighboring properties. And actually, that's a city code. So we have to detain it all on site.
I would just address the commissioners to condition of approval number 19, which does relate to the stormwater. And prior to the conditions of approval, the site plan does show that the existing stormwater area is to be retained.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody wish to speak in response to that? Seeing none, thank you. All right. Okay. Please state your name.
I want to make, Daryl Prinz, just want to make one correction. Mr. Bryson asked me whether or not we had expressed our concerns. We did send a separate letter, and I was incorrect. We did send a separate letter to you.
Thank you. All right. The ORS, Section 197.763, Paragraph 6A, states that upon request, the Commission must either grant a continuance for no less than 7 days or hold the record open for no less than 7 days to permit any participant an opportunity to provide additional testimony, argument, or evidence. Does any person who participated desire to request a continuance to provide additional testimony, argument, or evidence, or request that the record be left open to submit additional written testimony, argument, or evidence? Seems the answer is no. All right. Does the applicant waive the opportunity to submit final written argument after the close of the record as provided in ORS Section 197.763, Paragraph 16?
You may want to make a motion, somebody, to close the hearing and close the record.
Okay, may we have a motion to close the hearing and the record?
I move we close the hearing and the record.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The hearing and the record is closed. Okay. So prior to or during deliberations, the Commission may consult with city staff and the city attorney. But, just a reminder, Commissioners, do not ask staff or legal counsel for new evidence. The case is kind of closed, and we have to deal with what we were sent and what we heard at the meeting tonight. Does the city attorney or staff have any comments concerning legal issues raised during these proceedings, instructions on the applicable law, or legal advice concerning the application of the law to the evidence in the record?
Just a few things. Obviously, the applicant in any land use case has the burden to demonstrate they meet all the applicable criterion. The planning director in this case found that the applicant met the criterion. An appeal was filed disputing the interpretations, in some cases, that the application of the law by the planning director. Briefly, just a few kind of important issues. I don't think that the mixed-use issue is an issue. Obviously, this is an amendment to an existing development plan. The amendment creates a mixed-use situation. Prior to the amendment, there was no mixed-use situation, so the applicable application is this amendment creating the mixed use. And staff has pretty much told you that the interpretation of mixed use is that it all doesn't instantaneously happen. All developments have timetables, and they can't instantaneously be developed together. So I don't see that as a substantive issue for the appeal. I think the planning director's interpretation and application of that standard is defensible. The shared parking agreement, you have kind of two arguments there. You have an argument that 1756.070 doesn't apply. That's the provision that talks about on a single parcel. And then you have another argument about 1756.060, which permits the shared parking provided there's no overlap in time. I believe that the recommendation and the findings of staff is that basically this is a condition of approval, that a shared parking agreement would specify that during these hours, the use is available for the apartment, and during these hours, the use is available for the dentist office. So a condition of approval may be the appropriate way to address this issue, because you can require that there be no overlap in time. That's just my suggestion, that you could approach this. I believe the planning staff's position on this is defensible. Again, and that's based on the 060 joint use of facilities section. I don't think 070 is applicable. The transportation impact study is a question that came up, and you have competent substantial evidence in the record from your planning director and your engineer saying that based on the language of the code, that no traffic or no safety hazard is created. So you could rely upon that in determining whether or not a traffic impact study was needed. There is no provision in the code that talks about the number of stories, but the issue isn't the number of stories, that the issue is density. And there's some findings and submissions in the record that says there's no density limitation in this zone. I tend to disagree. And again, I'm not the planning director, but I do read that 17-24020F says elderly housing units developed under the standards and provisions of the low-density section of the RM zone. So when you look at the low-density section of the RM zone, and that's, of course, the multifamily residential zone. I'm scrolling, sorry. 17-20050, minimum lot area and density requirements. The minimum lot area shall be 5,000 square feet for a single-family dwelling and a minimum of 8,000 square feet for a duplex, or the first 2 units of a multifamily development. For each additional dwelling unit, the following standards shall apply. And then, remember, the code says the low-density standards of the RM zone. Low density, where the entire lot is in excess of 150 feet from a boundary of a commercial zone, the lot must have an additional area of 2,250 square feet for each additional dwelling. I don't know that I heard anyone address that, but I do know that the applicant has proposed 5 units that are proposed to be, senior living units. So that, I think, deserves some discussion on the part of the commission. Again, I'm only just reading what the code says. This was a specific issue that was pointed out by the appellant. They said, wait a minute, this says she said, you are applying the wrong zoning standard. I think this is what she was talking about. Because there's findings, or there are submissions in the submittals here by the applicant that say, hey, there's no density limit in this zone. Well, I think that pulling in the elderly units does trigger a density calculation. Whether or not that's met or not, I don't know, but I haven't read anything about that.
How could we determine whether it's met or not if we don't have the information?
I'm simply telling you that the appellants have argued that you've misapplied the code. They said you're not applying the correct zoning district. For the most part, I don't think that's accurate, but there is a reference to density in this zone that refers to the density calculations for the senior units. So I don't have that information. I don't know if there's anything in the record with that in regard to this. I haven't seen anything. The issues about drainage obviously are already addressed in conditions of approval. So we've heard a lot about drainage, but we all know that the drainage after you develop has to comply with the drainage before, and there's already some conditions about that, as the applicant and his attorney already stated. I do think it's probably important to say that you got to demonstrate compliance with the Fair Housing Act exemption for senior housing. If that's what you're actually saying you're doing, then you got to comply with that. Again, that's a condition of approval, that in order to maintain that only 1 parking space, you got to comply, which means verifying age and doing everything you're required to do. Aside from that, I don't have any additional comments, but I'll try to answer your questions.
Richard, do you have any?
Actually, I want to get clarification from Mr. Apichello on that. Are you saying that the RM standards would apply for the whole development, or are you saying just for the 5 elderly housing units?
I think it applies for the 5 elderly housing units at a minimum. I don't really think it wouldn't be triggered, but for the fact that it's the elderly units. So you have 5 elderly units, you have some additional density requirements in terms of area. I don't think it is the entirety. Is that's the way?
That answers my question. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Gary.
kind of on the same, how do we, can we leave this open for more evidence?
No more evidence, but I can tell you that there is in evidence in the conditions of approval for the site plan review, which is in evidence. It says that the 2 lots that are proposed for the apartments contain 60,077 square feet of lot area. So you're able to do the calculation that Mr. Apicello suggested, where 8,000 square feet for the first 2 and 2,250 square feet for the other 3. If that's less than 60,077 square feet, then you could conclude that that's met.
So run that by us again, the figures. 80,000 for the first 2.
8,000 for the first 2.
First 2. 750 square feet.
2,250 square feet for each additional unit. There's 3 more. So if that adds up to something less than 60,077 square feet, then
like 15,000, so yes, it does.
So this is important because if you don't address something like this that was specifically raised, then the issue could be remanded to you for.
So we're talking mathematically under 15,000 versus the 60,000.
So it seems to meet the, yeah. Okay, anything else? All right, the matter is now returned to our table for deliberations and an oral decision. The floor is open. Commissioner Robinson?
Well, it seemed to me that what we've been hearing is about parking, zoning, traffic, and the history of this project. It seems like we could scratch the history as in consideration. This is, the way it looks to me is this is almost like a new project. Traffic, I agree with Mr. Apicello's assessment. We've heard anecdotal evidence of people speeding up and down that road, but we also have a study that shows that we're well under the capacity of that road to sustain the traffic. That zoning question, I don't really, well, I guess I don't want to address it until I hear more from the rest of the commissioners. I don't really understand it completely yet. The zoning question. Yeah, the RM versus.
Why, you don't understand why we rezoned it mixed use, or?
No, I don't understand what the appellant's issue was with the zoning question. How RM applies to this.
You just referenced that, right? So,
Yes.
I believe that what they were arguing, and again, we can't ask them but this is what I believe they were addressing when they said that you apply the wrong zoning district. I believe they were referring to the fact that by triggering the senior units, you trigger expressly in the language the requirements of the low density for the RM zone. So I think
RM?
yeah.
And that,
That's the question.
what is that an acronym for?
Multifamily residential.
Okay.
Yeah. So they basically said, wait, there's these assertions that there's no density requirement. I think that's wrong. I think that when you propose these senior units, basically, you're triggering a density calculation. Richard's telling you, based on the evidence in the record, it's not violated. But
I'm sorry, what, it's that it's not viable?
violated.
Oh, violated.
It's not violated. no.
But again, you have to address the arguments made by the appellants. The appellants are probably correct in the sense that we needed to address this. It is addressed in the sense that it appears that it's not over the density permitted.
Yeah, my issue, in addition to being vague on the ordinance itself, is the planning commission, we're sitting here, is it appropriate or even legal for us at this sitting to make a density calculation?
Well, it's one of the specific arguments that the appellants made, that the planning director did not correctly apply the law, and basically that Mr. Townsend's telling you that this provision is complied with, even if they didn't mention it specifically otherwise.
That's that even if part that I'm quibbling about. Even.
Well, I mean,
what we're doing is saying, okay, well, the density calculation now needs to be done if we accept the.
I think your findings, for example, could say that the appellant is correct in pointing out that staff didn't address the density reference referring to the RM zone. However, it's not, does not change the result that this still meets all the applicable criteria. So they're right, but they're not, it doesn't change the result.
Is that statement in evidence, or is that new information for us?
I think it's in evidence. And again, what my job isn't to introduce new evidence. My job is to help you apply the facts, the things that were said, to the law. So I'm telling you, I think this is applying the facts to the law. In this case, I think the facts in the record, according to your planning director, are telling you there's still no noncompliance.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could, before we go too far down the road, it's your job to decide whether I was right and also essentially whether Mr. Apicella was right. You're free to disagree with what I've said. You're free to disagree with what Mr. Apicella says. If you think they are right that the RM should apply project-wide, you're free to make that decision. He's just telling you his interpretation, and I'm telling you mine.
Sure, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Certainly wouldn't be the first time if you disagreed with me, so.
Does the zoning change for this property with the approval of this?
No.
No, so it's still PC, correct?
Yes. But because they've proposed 5
Right.
elderly units, it says, oh, go look at the low-density provision of the RM zone.
Would that apply just to the one building with those units in it, or for the whole site?
I believe that's what Mr. Townsend asked, and I believe
That's your decision. My decision was that it doesn't apply, but that's...
But if we decide it does apply, then other factors would come into play, including the height, right?
Including what?
Height.
Height, landscaping, actually it just says according to the low-density standard.
It talks about low density. It doesn't say apply all the RM standards.
Right.
It just
This
refers
is
to
the
low
low-density standard.
Yeah, we're talking about density, not building.
All right, thank you.
So then you could do your calculation on, if you thought it applied to the whole project, you could do your calculation for 30 units as opposed to what you just did for 5.
And then my fourth point was about parking. This dentist office, I guess we've heard that they have 6 or so employees, 6 or 7 employees.
6, I think, yeah.
I'm presuming 2 of those are dentists and a couple of them are techs and the rest are admin. So if you have 2 dentists and 2 techs, you're really only going to have 4 clients. So that's 10 parking spaces, 10 or 11 parking spaces at most in the dentist's parking lot. are probably ever going to be occupied, and there's 18 spots there, so it seems to me pretty
17.
clear we've got a 7 spare most of the time. And certainly, I agree, we would put that in to the conditions of approval, the hours of overlap. That's what I had to say.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else?
Well, I'm checking off my list here, and so pretty much all my questions have been answered. I do have one concern, and I don't know how it interrelates to it because it doesn't have anything to do with the builder itself. But I would imagine that a lot of the people that are going to be renting these apartments are going to be working at the hospital or working close by.
We don't know.
We don't know, but there's going to be additional foot traffic, and one person did bring up the running across the highway, and having been hit by a car one time crossing a road, I think a crosswalk would be a good idea, but that doesn't really fall on the responsibility of the builder. That's more or less the responsibility of our service division.
The real question, again, that's aside from the issues that are really present before you today. So that's an entirely separate issue. No matter, well, I won't add anything to the record, but it's irrelevant. That's really what it comes down to.
Okay. But that's something that could be dealt with at a later time, obviously.
Right.
Well,
More thoughts, Patty?
yeah, I have a few thoughts. You know, I'm generally in favor of this kind of infill development, and I do appreciate the desire to create housing in a city that really needs it a lot. We hear this all the time. I don't want to make an assumption of low income. I don't think that's fair, and I don't think low income is a surrogate for criminal activity. I suspect everybody in this room has lived in an apartment at one time or another in their life. So the concern I have is that in terms of looking at the application of the codes, whether it makes sense or not from a pragmatic standpoint, the parking is not sufficient for the number of units. Suggesting that the dental office should be shared space, I'm not terribly comfortable with that. We're talking about 7 slots needed, which would reduce your units, in my math, by 4. 3.5 really, but 4 units would find you the additional, or would lower the number of parking spaces that were necessary under the existing non-pragmatic code that we have for parking. I think that could be taken into consideration from a design perspective. I think the design could be a little more creative, take into account the neighborhood environment, and get the parking to the level that is required. Otherwise, I think the other issues that have been raised are related to zoning inconsistencies that probably need to be cleaned up, but this isn't the time or the place to do that. So those are my thoughts.
So your suggestion was if the developer reduced the number of apartments by 4, that they would have sufficient parking space.
Parking, which seems to be one of the major issues.
I kind of agree with Commissioner Robinson's thoughts. If you've got only 2 dentists and a couple clerks or technicians that are working there, and even if you've got a couple patients backed up, that you're not using that 20-some spaces of parking in that dentist office at all. And if an agreement is made that actually constricts the property, actually constricts the ownership of the property, whoever it is, if they can make an agreement with Mr. Dennis ransom, I guess, that does that, and that's a condition of the build. I can't see how that is a restrictive issue that wouldn't go, And I guess, if the opposite is if you can basically take 4 apartments out of the complex, we can probably get it not to be built because it wouldn't be financially feasible anymore. And it's what I see in this community, because I have kids that are trying to move here, and it's been an ongoing battle. And I know that's not the battle right now, but it is a battle that we're supposed to fix. We're not supposed to put roadblocks up every time we can to make sure it doesn't happen. We're supposed to try to make it happen for all of the parties involved. And I'm in the same mode that I don't want it in my backyard. And I know that's not the issue here for everybody. I understand that. And I also understand the concern for having pedestrian accessibility along the Cascade Head to Bay Trail. But we have to get moving forward somehow on making affordable housing available in this community. Or to say, don't employ anybody because you can't afford to get them in here.
No, I totally agree with you that we need affordable housing in this community. I also think this is the Planning Commission, and we have a duty to have a long-term planning perspective for the good of the community at large. What I heard from the folks who manage these buildings is it isn't a question of build it and they will come. They're already here, and filling these apartments does not sound to me like it's going to be a difficult thing to do. So I'd like to see us build with the intent of a long-term perspective. That dentist office could sell tomorrow to an orthodontist that runs a,
But he would have the agreement.
bunch of people through there.
He would have the agreement on his
Right,
deed.
and then would have an ongoing conflict with the apartment buildings, which
No,
we
it
may
would
be
be on
able
his
to
deed,
avoid.
wouldn't it?
Could I interject something here? Are we planning, or are we addressing the issues of the ordinance and their legality? We're not planning, we're not doing long-term Lincoln City planning for affordable housing. What we're doing is addressing the parking and the zoning, parking, zoning, and the traffic issues that were brought up. It seems to me like all those legal questions have been answered.
Well, it doesn't meet it based on the planning codes that we have. The parking is not sufficient.
They have an agreement.
I think the parking you could gain those other 4 parking spots by shrinking the existing parking spaces that's in there now. But I always like the idea of bigger parking slots. But if you want the additional ones, then they're going to shrink all the other ones and make them smaller to gain the other 4 parking spots that you're asking for.
The other issue that I think the applicant brought up is that 1 parking spot is assigned by lease per apartment, which means, I think,
I didn't hear what you said.
when somebody leases an apartment, say if this apartment is built, they, 1 parking spot becomes associated with the lease of their apartment. I believe that's what I heard.
I heard that as that some apartment managers make that a rule. I didn't hear in evidence that was going to happen in this case. Did anybody else?
Anybody else recall?
I surmise that because evidently they were builders of another apartment complex by Weimar.
I think they were referring to that
And
complex.
they had that policy in place at that location, so I made that assumption.
That's not the code.
It's not the code, right.
Yeah, I think that's just a management policy question. I don't think it's a condition of improvement.
No.
My other point about taking out 4 units of an apartment building like this is something like 15% of your bottom line. And construction light, that's just math, right? 30 into 4. Projects that can pencil at some price aren't going to pencil at a 14% reduction in your bottom line. 14 is not evidence. That's just a number I pull out of my head.
Mr. Chairman, just a reminder that what you can do is affirm, reverse, modify, or remand. So you can't just say, let's remove 4 units. If, however, you said the density calculation was wrong, the density calculation for the whole project should be based upon the low-density calculation in RM, then you could say, based upon that, we need to remove units to get under the, the appropriate number. And you'd need the planning director to help you there. But that's the basis upon which you would modify to bring it into compliance with the code. So when you would, if you had a condition on the parking and you said, okay, we don't believe that we don't believe that apartments need a parking space 100% of the time, so the applicant can go off and demonstrate in a written agreement, as it provides for in the code, that he can create a shared parking arrangement with the neighbor where the neighbor agrees in writing that this is the time when this space is available, and during this time the apartment user can use it, and then outside of that they cannot. But it depends on whether or not you believe, that you don't believe the appellant in this case that you need it 100% of the time you need a parking space. So again, we can fashion modifications if you have a rationale to get you to compliance, but not just, hey, I'd like to see everybody have red window dressings or something.
Say the 4 words again.
Approve,
Affirm,
reverse,
affirm.
modify, or remand. So modify, I was addressing modify. If you want to change the conditions, you want to add conditions, you want to remove number of units to comply with what you believe the density is, then you could modify, but you can't just modify because you'd like to see this or that. Add a play area. Well, it's not required by the code, so you couldn't just do that. But you could say, we believe the planning director made an error, and reverse. That wouldn't be terribly productive. Affirming it, obviously, then the appellants would have the ability to file an additional appeal if they wish to. Modify, again, if you have a legitimate basis to modify, you can do that. Or remand. You could send it back to the planning director and say, we've heard some issues identified. We'd like you to go back and fix these and bring it back.
So
remake the decision.
The 4 words, prove means deny.
Affirm, reverse.
Means deny the appeal.
Correct.
Is that what you mean?
Well, affirming the director's decision would be the first decision. Reversing the director's decision would be the second. Modifying the director's decision would be the third. And remanding it to the director to remake his decision concerning whatever it is that you want him to do. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I think we need to do some more work on the density issue, whether we feel it applies just to building C, where the elderly housing units are, or it applies to the entire development.
Was that a question or a statement?
I think we need to talk about it, so, yeah. Any thoughts on that? That's the question.
Well, that gets back to sending it back to the director for modification then, doesn't it?
I'm wondering if it's a condition of approval that the director prove that the density calculation works if you treat it as an RM. And if we can do that, then is it our decision to apply that RM just to the building or the units that are affected by it, or to the entire development? And does that affect the density calculation? Can we make that kind of thing a condition of approval?
Generally, you can't ask in a condition of approval to do something that requires evidence and the application of facts to the law like that. I think really the interpretation is the key thing. So where it was if it was a non-discretionary thing, if you gave the director, said, okay, apply this parking calculation, and if it complies, go forward. Or you say, city engineer, apply this, stormwater management standard, and if it complies, it can go forward. When it's non-discretionary like that, then it's fine. But where you're requiring interpretation, I think you're being asked to make a decision. I think you could send it back to the director and ask him to remake the decision addressing specifically the density issue, or you could modify it, do that now, saying this is how we believe that the density applies, and we're doing that by adding a condition of approval that says the density is met based upon the application of the low-density standard to the 8-unit apartment building. And then if someone doesn't like that interpretation, they would file an appeal and say, we disagree with that. So 2 ways to do it: send it back to the director, or you make the decision. Does it apply to the whole? Does it apply just to the building that has a low income in it? Or the elderly unit?
My 2 cents would be, I think it applies to the building that has the 4 elderly housing units in it.
I agree with that.
All right.
So we need to send it back to the director?
No, we would need to send it back to the director if we believe the density applied to all of the 3 units. What we're saying is we feel it applies just to the 1 unit that has the 4 housing units for elderly. 5, excuse me, yeah. And it's well within the density calculation for an RM zone. All right. Anyone want to make a motion?
I'm not sure how to word that condition of approval. Did you copy down Mr. Apicciolo's?
No, I did not.
Do you remember it?
I think I could use that. We affirm the director's report and let it stand. Is that a proper motion?
Do you want to add the condition with the?
I would say you affirm it and modify it in the following respects, and then you would say.
I don't wish to add the modification.
Okay.
Is there a second to Commissioner Schlesinger's motion?
I second it.
Discussion.
Could you restate your motion, please, Miles?
Into the microphone.
I move to affirm the decision that was made by Richard Townsend as director of the planning department.
Thank you.
I would like to suggest we add an amendment to that to modify.
I already heard that rejected by the motion maker,
All
so
right, okay, so.
I think you should vote on the motion.
May we have a roll call vote, please, if there's not
Sure.
further discussion?
Right.
Roll call.
Robinson,
Yes.
Schlesinger,
Yes.
Crowan,
No.
Bryson,
Yes.
Cunningham,
Yes.
and Griffiths.
Yes. The
Motion
passed.
carries.
Okay. All right. Planning staff will bring back written findings for approval and signature at our next regular meeting. Okay. The final written decision of the Planning Commission may be appealed to the City Council. The notice of decision will be mailed to all persons who testified or submitted comments, and the appeal deadline will be included in the notice. All right. Going forward, we have no old business, no new business, no training for the Planning Commission. Any reports and comments from staff or the city attorney's staff?
We did have some planning commissioner training for tonight, but it lasts about half an hour, so I suggest we put it off to the next meeting.
I heartily agree to that. I'm sure everybody else does too. Yeah.
And as far as comments, I just want to remind everybody, we've got the Imagine Lincoln City project continuing, visioning project, and urge everyone to participate. There's a survey online, and there's also at various places around the city, there's idea boxes for people to say what their big ideas are. There's one, actually there's two on this floor. There's one in the library, one at the Cultural Center, one in the Community Center, and one at the Chamber of Commerce, and they will move around from time to time.
Great, please participate in that. Anything else? Any comments from our commissioners? All right.
Wait, I just have one. I wanted to thank you guys for sending or providing this additional vicinity map for the project tonight, and just request that in the future that we get this kind of small-scale, large area map for any sort of land use decisions we're making.
Good idea.
And then I do have one topic for future discussion, that is if we could do something with color coordination for the downtown core area to, we've talked about this in the past, having some sort of code set up for selecting colors on the outside of businesses on our.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. Color coding on what?
Just to have, set up a program that we could direct people to using certain colors on the outsides of their building. We've talked about it in the past, but we've never really had a big discussion on it, but I'd kind of like to go there. I think that's part of the beautification of the city. And
That could be part of Imagine Lincoln City then. Yeah, put your thoughts.
Sure,
on
that can be. Also, we do plan on doing some revision to our existing commercial design standards, and that's something that can be addressed in that. But
that was the word I was looking, commercial design standards. Thank you.
And also going forward, I'd like to, the transportation, look at West Devils Lake Road and that area in particular, and to see where crosswalks may need to be put in to ensure pedestrian safety. Yeah.
I agree with that.
Any future agenda items? Next meeting?
the next meeting, we have the transportation system plan, ordinance amendments, and I think that's, and planning commissioner training now. So I think that's all.
All right. We are adjourned.